All right, everybody, we are here with Seth from Transcendent Philosophy, and today we're going to be talking about what else? Metaethics. This is my second official Meta Monday as well. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, Seth, but I'm trying to get on a more regular schedule when I talk about stuff, and I figured, Monday, Metaethics has the alliteration going for it, and I can get as much as my Metaethics fill on Monday out of the way so that the rest of the week I could start focusing on other topics. So
Well, is there
that's what I'm
anything
here to
better to
do.
focus on than metaethics, though? I mean, it,
Well, there's only so much you could say about it in a week. So if I stream like 4 or 5 times about metaethics, I never get overwhelmed. But I do feel like my audience might be like, all right, we've heard this 6,000 times. So I'm trying to get people other topics. I'm starting to bring in AI. I want to bring more meta science on here. I have had a couple guests, so there are other topics that I cover, but metaethics for me is definitely my favorite topic. I don't know if is it your favorite topic? What do you like talking about?
yeah, I'm very passionate about morality. So yeah, this is definitely something I'm passionate about for sure.
Cool. Okay. So, would you mind introducing yourself? And since I think this is going on your channel as well, I'd be happy to introduce myself as well if you'd like me to.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I started this channel, Transcendent Philosophy. Basically, I don't come from a traditional academic philosophy background. I was an accountant and a software engineer. Then I had a bunch of health issues and kind of some disabilities and things that kind of like destroyed my career. And it really made me contemplate the meaning in life. And I just kind of became obsessed with philosophy and have been doing that ever since. And just investigating a variety of topics in philosophy space that I'm kind of interested in on my channel. And one of those is metaethics, which is probably out of all that, I'm kind of diversified in lots of topics, but probably the biggest slice of the pie is metaethics that I do. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So, my name is Lance Bush. I started my channel mostly to talk about metaethics. Now, I'm also kind of a very dedicated moral anti-realist, which sounds a little weird to be like super anti something, and then to say I guess I think of like the atheist movement and stuff like that, where people's movements are centered on what they're opposed to. But a big thing for me is, at the very least, hoping to convince people that anti-realism doesn't entail being a morally bankrupt evil monster. That if we're wrong about anything, it's about like metaphysics, but we still can act like regular normal people. So my background is I guess I could say it's a bit more in the traditionally academic background. So I got my master's in philosophy at Tufts, then I did a PhD in psychology at Cornell. Now the psychology PhD, I very much did psychology and do psychology while I was there. I've done research on the psychology of charitable giving and worked on some other projects. But for me, I see philosophy and psychology as very much intertwined, and I study morality basically from a very interdisciplinary perspective. The thing is, though, with all the degrees and all that stuff, I've always had this kind of a thing where I'm not a big fan of an excessive emphasis on credentials or I don't like the like elite ivory tower type of vibe that I get from a lot of academia. And so for me, a big thing is I think everybody should get in on conversations. As long as people do the research and are respectful and appreciate and acknowledge the work that's done in a given field without just being completely dismissive. I love everybody getting in on conversations, and especially philosophy, I think should be something that's very much accessible and egalitarian. So I don't go around, I'm not sitting here like putting like Dr. Lance Bush in my title.
Yeah,
I'm not big on that. So anyway, so just to
yeah,
say, just because
I
I have the
appreciate that.
education, I don't think it counts. Yeah, I don't think that gives me some kind of massive edge personally.
Yeah. Well, you can think that all you want, but I totally respect your education. And I love how you're kind of bringing this polymath approach to philosophy, the synergy between psychology and philosophy. I've watched your channel and I really love your approach. And I do see the connection to like atheism, right? The anti-realist approach, it feels kind of like an atheistic approach. And I do feel the pull to that. Yeah. You had a poll question on your YouTube channel, which was something to the effect of, have you changed people's minds or moved them a little bit on these issues? And I was one of the people that, I've listened to your arguments and I've felt the pull. But I haven't been fully persuaded. So maybe you can help me get over what remaining hurdles that I have on anti-realism.
We'll see. I think persuasion, at least on this issue. Now, I do think people are persuadable on philosophical topics, but realism and anti-realism, I don't see a lot of movement there. At least I don't suspect that there's a lot of movement. I think a lot of people on that poll, and by the way, for everybody that answered that poll, thanks so much. If you haven't answered the poll, it should still be open. You could answer it. A lot of people chose that their views had changed a little, and then when they commented, they said, "Look, my views haven't changed. I was always an anti-realist, or I'm still a realist." But you've clarified some of the issues. And if I can at least do that, I count that as a win. I would like people to reject what my position actually is and not some, caricature that they have in their minds. And I do think that there's a lot of mutual caricaturing that goes on, especially in the sort of public discourse around realism and anti-realism. And that's another parallel with the atheism versus like Christian apologetics world, which I'm also, kind of, I dip my toes in there on occasion. And I just see so much hostility and caricaturing. And, I used to be much more of like the atheists we're right and the Christians are wrong. And I just saw so many bad arguments from atheists that I'm like, I think I'm going to step out of this space for a while. I'm not like the whole Sky Daddy thing. Like, oh, you guys believe in a Sky Daddy, like the mockery and ridicule. I don't like it.
Yeah, these types of things. Yeah, humans we're pretty combative sometimes, but it takes a lot of effort to kind of try to be more cooperative on these issues. So yeah, I aspire to that as well.
Yeah, it does. I used to be a lot more combative and argumentative in like a very aggressive way, and I do think that's my sort of my natural default. Like my default settings are like yell at everybody and be a jerk. So it's taken a long time to overcome that. And if I talk to somebody and they're really rude and disrespectful, and I think that they're just being ridiculously arrogant or super uncharitable, or they seem like they're intentionally distorting my words for a gotcha, it gets under my skin, and I feel that angry side of me wants to come out, and I don't want it to. Yeah. This is one good thing about live streams is I can't afford to get super mad here. So I try to keep myself in check. Although I haven't had big jerks on here. You will run into them elsewhere. So, but not so much here. Anyway, anything you wanted to clear out of the way before we get started? We didn't even set up a format or anything. So we could this is just open territory for us to talk about what we want to talk about.
Yeah. So I do have a lot of thoughts, but maybe you have thoughts on where you want to go. But I know that you saw my prior debate on metaethics. And I've been kind of reflecting on how that one went. And I think I see it seems like a lot of it was semantic disagreements and maybe methodological or disagreements about standards and definitions. And so part of me thinks it might be more productive to take a step back and analyze all of those issues before drilling down. You know what I mean?
I think that's a fantastic idea. I love getting into the nitpicky, pedantic stuff about language and definitions. So I'm happy to do that. Where would you like to start with that?
So yeah, I think you titled it perfectly. I think you're on my wavelength with your thumbnail. Basically, realism. We got to figure out what realism is before we do moral realism, right? And so I don't know. Maybe you could go first, and then we could go back and forth on what we think about realism.
Sure. So realism in a general sense, in at least an academic philosophy, actually, let me take a step back from that. Okay. So first, you already have this situation in academic disciplines where different fields will use terminology in different ways. So for instance, valid or validity means something completely different in psychology as it does in philosophy. So in philosophy, validity typically has to do with the structure of syllogisms and it has to do with logic, whereas validity in psychology has to do with measurements and whether something measures what it's intended to measure. And there's just different concepts that use the same word. Now, those are both appropriate extensions of the sort of ordinary language or colloquial use of the term valid or validity, but valid or validity also has a sort of everyday colloquial analog or a sort of cluster of analogs. So in everyday life, people will say, yeah, that's valid. People will even say valid to say something like to affirm what someone else is saying or say that's cool. Oh yeah, that's valid. So words are, I mean, a few things to say about words and language. Language is constantly evolving. The idea that you could lock down words and say it's got this meaning and only this meaning is, I think, absurd. And it's very frustrating when people try to appeal to like Merriam-Webster or dictionary.com or something to say that's what the word means.
Yes.
Words are constantly moving targets. They're polysemous. They have multiple meanings. And they're not just polysemous in the sense that like bank can refer, this is an example I use a lot, can refer to like a financial, like a place you go to get money, or a riverbank. They're also polysemous in the sense of the same word will have shadings and gradations. And so there'll be like that word 1.0, that word 1.1, that word 1.2. So they'll be like, it's really more like words are used to signify sort of like a distribution of possible usages and at any given time. And those distributions are constantly moving. It's absurd how flexible language is. And a lot of times what allows words to vary in their meaning and their usage is the words around them, the tone of voice, the contexts in which they're used. That could be the social context, the situation you're in, the social relation between two people, the other words around the word. So language is technically messy, but human minds are just extraordinarily good at processing all that context really, really quickly and generating a reasonable inference. But what that means is when people are speaking, we're constantly sort of predicting and inferring what we think they mean based on what they say, based on our background assumptions. And that can often lead people astray and they make mistakes. So prefacing that with like language is it has this like flexible context-driven nature. Then you take language, like terminology that's used in everyday discourse, and academics in different disciplines will take some of those words and apply them in more narrow specific contexts within this discipline and this other discipline and this other discipline. Realism is like that. I've actually seen the term realism and also even the term moral realism used in political contexts. And I've seen it used to like talking about movies and TV shows and stuff. I haven't looked into its use there, but it looks like it has a totally different meaning than it does in philosophy. And it's literally the same words. So you already have words that have an everyday analog, then they're transposed into different disciplines. So then I'll move into philosophy, but just know like words like realism and moral have analogs in other fields, anthropology, psychology. These fields will use those terms differently. Within philosophy, realist accounts strike me as they don't have a uniform meaning across the issues about which one is a realist. A realist about mathematics, that may or may not be a precise analog to realism about morality or realism about the objects of scientific theories. So all of these accounts of realism differ in a variety of ways, but I take the sort of fundamental unity between them, the connection between them, to be on the side very crudely of saying something is the case in a context in which there's some expectation that there's some non-negligible proportion of people who deny that it's the case, whatever that may be. It doesn't have to be metaphysically robust. It doesn't have to be the assertion that some actual like object exists, because there are people that call themselves realists, like Derek Parfit about morality, where they want to strip realism of its substantive ontological commitments. There might also be pragmatist realists and stuff like that. So I can't even say it's people that think something exists versus people that think something doesn't exist, because they might just say, we think certain concepts are true and other people reject those concepts. So I don't think you could have a one-size-fits-all definition of realism that would apply across all of philosophy. So you don't even have a single uniform definition across all of academic fields. Even within philosophy, I don't think you have a uniform definition there. And then you drill down to morality, and that's where you can give a somewhat more precise definition. I typically take the definition in moral philosophy to be the claim that there are stance-independent moral facts. I take that to be the sort of mainstream sort of contemporary definition. What I should note, though, is that even within mainstream contemporary analytic philosophy, there are moral realists that would give more minimal definitions and ones that would give more maximal definitions. And so the more minimal ones might just say it's the view that there are moral facts, whether they're stance independent or not. A more maximal definition might include additional theses, like it's in addition to the claim that there are stance independent moral facts, they might also include like an epistemic thesis, like, and that we have some knowledge of at least some of these facts, something like that. And so you get this sort of range of realist accounts that vary from extremely minimal to very robust. And the one I tend to settle on is kind of in the middle, but meets a minimum threshold to me for excluding certain kinds of accounts that I think bear too many affinities with anti-realist accounts for it to be a useful way to include them in one's conception of realism. And what I have in mind by that are like moral relativist accounts, which I think that a better way of dividing the line should typically include many of those in the anti-realist camp. Now I said a lot there, so I'll stop there and I'll see what you have to say about all that.
Yeah, that was awesome. I totally agree with like the whole linguistic thing. I anyone who knows me knows that I struggle with language because I feel like it's such an archaic and kind of a broken tool that we're using because of all the impreciseness and intersubjective, miscommunications and all that, the calculation errors when processing context and whatnot. Or like even the educational background informs the usage of a word. If someone doesn't have the educational background, they misinterpret the word, right? Totally agree with all that. Yeah, so like my perspective on linguistics is kind of an evolutionary perspective and a utilitarian perspective, such that words are valuable in the sense that they help us accomplish our goals. And so, and the goals come from evolution. And so the question for me, when I'm using a word, if I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to use the word, I'm like, what type of problems am I trying to solve with this word, right? And so when I'm working or when I'm communicating with another person, we have to kind of agree on the problems and then we can get the optimal definition to solve the problem. So for me, for realism, okay, so I think so I have a way of framing what you're saying, and maybe I think you will agree, and so I guess it's just a terminology problem, and we'll see if you can see if you like my way of framing it. It sounds like you're pointing to a distinction between what I call ontological objectivity versus epistemic objectivity. So if I'm trying to remember how you worded it, something to the effect of, in realism, there's the question of, does a thing exist, and does it exist in an independent way, right? So the word objective could be inferring this independence, and the word ontological could imply existence, right? So ontologically objective would be, it exists as an object in an independent way, where epistemically objective would absolve itself of the requirement for an ontological object to exist. So, for example, to make this distinction more clear, like the Platonistic idea of math, right? Like this abstract object of the number 7 floating in abstract space, right? If that object exists, that would be like an ontologically objective number 7. But if that object does not exist, but it's still independent in this different way, it's independent in an epistemic way, I would call that epistemically objective number 7. Does that seem like a fair distinction to you?
Can you go over the epistemically objective one again?
Yeah, epistemically objective is the way we come to know it is independent of our stances. That's so the number 7, everyone uses different epistemics to approach this number 7. It exists independent of all the different epistemics involved, because there would be one correct epistemic that gives us the number 7.
I'm fine with running with that distinction for now, but I feel like I'm not sure for me whether the distinctions would end up collapsing into one another, or there being some sort of sense in which I find in the deployment of the concepts that, like, maybe I don't find the distinction to be helpful or reflective of my own way of thinking about things. But I'm fine with running with them for now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And maybe some examples will help clarify this distinction. Um, okay, let's see. So yeah, so like gravity is an interesting one. So basically, gravity, it relies on celestial bodies, right? And so you have these different celestial bodies, planets, stars, galaxies, comets, they're all floating around. And maybe you wouldn't agree with this usage, but I would view each of these celestial bodies as having a stance, right? And so the stance of Jupiter, based on the stance of Jupiter, it creates Jupiter's gravity. Based on the stance of Earth, it creates Earth's gravity. Based on the stance of the moon, it creates the moon's gravity. And all of these have slightly different gravitational forces. And the interaction between all these forces is somewhat chaotic. It's somewhat imprecise. It's hard to navigate. There's the three-body problem, which is it's a problem in physics, but there's a recent Netflix series based on this problem, which is when you have three celestial bodies, it becomes very hard to predict the movement of these celestial bodies because their gravitational forces collapse into this chaotic system where all the tiny variables become extremely important for predictive purposes. And so what I'm trying to get at is, I think most people would say gravity is epistemically objective, as in there is a correct epistemological paradigm that is independent of all our subjective stances that can help us derive the movement of celestial bodies. But despite the fact that there's a lot of unpredictability, a lot of inaccuracy, a lot of difficulty in calculating, and a lot of relativism relative to each of the celestial bodies, despite all of that, this phenomenon of gravity is still stance independently objective. Epistemically stance independent.
Okay. So I think that in the academic literature on like metaethics and metanormativity more generally, that sounds like saying something like some type of epistemic realism is true, where there are stance-independent facts about what sort of epistemic practices, standards, means of reasoning, coming to conclusions, forming justified beliefs, and acquiring knowledge, like that one ought to employ. There's like a correct set of epistemic procedures that one ought to employ. Would that be roughly paralleling what you're talking about?
Not exactly. I'm not talking about epistemic normativity. I'm talking about ontological accuracy, right? It's like there exists some mind-independent truth about where Jupiter is going, right? Mm-hmm. And for thousands of years, no one on Earth understood the trajectory of Jupiter, but that epistemological framework existed despite no one understanding it. And we've been learning this epistemological framework, and now we are able to tap into this epistemic objectivity.
Maybe I'm having some issues here because I'm not seeing where the epistemic part's coming in and the ontological part's coming out.
Okay.
Does this distinction end up doing work in how you frame your position? Because I don't know if we should get like focus on this or try to move past it.
Okay. Maybe we can move on to moral realism and then refer back to this once it's relevant.
Okay. I had given this characterization of moral realism as the claim that there are stance-independent moral facts. What do you make of that sort of characterization?
Stance-independent moral facts. I think that's fine. But I think that what's going to become really relevant is how we define morality, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe I can just kind of grant a bunch of things that you'll probably agree with, and we can get away with get those out of the way for further discussion. So for morality's sake, I largely grant that there's no, okay, so the problem is morality is this messy topic, right? Morality, just like you said, there's different aspects to how a word is used. I think that morality as a umbrella term encompasses a variety of aspects. So I would grant that for a large part, most of those aspects are not universal. They don't apply from case to case. I would grant that most of morality is not absolute. It's not consistent from context to context. I would grant that it's somewhat relative based on context to context. I would grant that most of morality is not eternal in nature. It varies over time. And I would grant that most of morality is not authoritative, such that there's no top-down authoritative function forcing morality on people. So getting all of that moral baggage out of the way, I do think there are objective things to discover and understand and predict about morality. Within this epistemic place, there are patterns to be discovered and to be understood within this umbrella category of morality. And so for me, I feel like anti-realism goes a little bit too far because it's subtracting out a lot of the stuff that deserves to be subtracted out, but completely subtracting, measurable objectivity seems just a bit too much.
We might find that the things that you think are real or true and are discoverable and measurable are things that I would affirm are true and real and discoverable. But it may be that I wouldn't want to call those stance independent moral facts. And if that's the case, we might end up actually agreeing on like what the world is like or what is true, at least within the context of this particular discussion. Maybe we would disagree on some other matter. And that's been one of my enduring issues with the sort of moral realist landscape, like of possible positions that people take. And, one of the things that I frequently say is that I have what's called this anti-realist trilemma. I don't know if you saw that in any of the videos from me. But what I will tend to say is that I regard all realist accounts that I've encountered so far as trivial, false, or unintelligible. The unintelligible accounts are probably the accounts, or at least primarily the accounts that you yourself are probably not endorsing. What I have in mind are the accounts that are largely in line with like G.E. Moore and non-naturalism. So Mike Humer, David Enoch, Terence Cuneo, Russ Schaefer Landau, the accounts which hold that there are irreducibly normative moral facts about what's good or bad or right or wrong that are have this, like what the facts consist of is a type of prescription or a fact about what one ought or ought not do that cannot be reduced to any sort of natural facts and cannot be reduced to any sort of descriptive facts. I take huge issue with that. And it seems like you might have excluded most of those in saying, here's what I don't think and here's what I do think. But the remaining like naturalist accounts, usually my issue with those isn't that they have some like major conceptual issues on my account, but that it's not clear to me whether the kind of realist account that they're offering is appreciably different from what I already think. And we're just engaged in some sort of like labeling dispute where, okay, we agree on what the facts are. It's like if I laid out a set of objects on the table, right? So you see like a spoon and an apple and a cup, and we're like, we agree there's a spoon, an apple, and a cup there, right? And we're like, yeah, we agree on what's there. And then I want to say, okay, so there's no overarching category. And then you might want to say, hey, there's a category of objects here. The spoon and the cup form the silverware category, and it's real. And then I don't want to grant that that's real. I want to say, hey, maybe that's a socially constructed way for you to organize it. It's not like a feature or property of the things themselves. And so the dispute ends up becoming one where it's largely a matter of like what stickers or labels we want to put on the objects in the world, rather than a dispute about what are the objects in the world. And then it becomes kind of a frustrating, like, are we arguing about words or are we arguing about reality? And maybe that's what the dispute comes down to, but I'd like to try to figure that out.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think we already foreshadowed that this was going to be the issue. It seems largely semantic and definitional. And so I guess it comes down to what I said earlier is like, what is the utility behind these words? What problems are we trying to solve with the words, right? And so I guess maybe I'll try to see if I can build out an argument for why an objective notion of morality would even be valuable in the first place. And maybe, and like, there's probably, so like, I'm going to guess that, well, from the anti-realist perspective, there's lots of problems. Like, so in a social space, there could be pros and cons to any type of structuring of definitions and whatever. And so I could foresee that you might say, well, maybe the objective notions of morality are very tyrannical and oppressive. And like, I would probably agree with a lot of that. But like, maybe like reducing morality to like something that's arbitrary would also have some costs. And so I guess maybe for social utility, it's kind of threading the line between the pros and cons. Like, how do we get rid of the tyrannical authoritative aspect of morality while preserving the aspect of morality that's not super arbitrary and is actually leads us to something beneficial? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you want to build that case, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, like, basically, I view morality as one of the most important things, right? Morality is basically the study of what is good. And like, what is good is like the number one thing of importance for anything, any sentient creature. We all want what is good, right? And maybe that's some amorphous mystery to us, but it's still good by definition. So it's something we want to pursue axiomatically. And so trying to figure out what this goodness is like, I don't know how anything could be more valuable than that. And so objectivity, to me, the easiest way to reduce the essential nature of objectivity is measurability, right? And measurability, I basically, just to build an argument for this, because people debate words all the time, objectivity etymologically means of or like an object. So the structure of an object is something that a third person perspective could verify its stance independent. That's objectivity. But how do we know something is stance independent? Measurement is kind of like the proof that something is stance independent. So that's why I like to appeal to measurability. But there is, in addition to like providing stance independence, measurability also has the utility of helping us find gradations of improvement, right? So once we can measure something, we can navigate. And when we can navigate, we can get more of the good thing, right? We can navigate away from the bad thing, navigate towards the good thing. And so trying to abandon notions of measurability seems like it would sabotage the navigation problem. And that's probably good enough for now.
Okay. Yeah. So, I don't think I'm trying to abandon notions of measurability. When I say I'm an anti-realist, I'm specifically rejecting particular positions as I see them in analytic philosophy. And so the position largely consists of or is constituted by a reaction to a particular subset of positions that are held by academic philosophers. And so what I'm saying is those people over there that are saying those things, I think they're mistaken about those things. And then the question turns on, well, what do those people think? What is their position? And I don't take it that Mike Humer or David Enoch or G.E. Moore, that the realists that I'm responding to, and this would include naturalists as well, would typically think of objectivity or stance independence in terms of measurability specifically. So I recognize that one of the meanings of objectivity in probably both ordinary use and some technical uses is associated with measurability. And in fact, this was actually borne out in my own research because, my actual area of specialization is the psychology of metaethics. And one of the big facets of my research was the use of open response questions where the participants get to write down their answers. And one of the things I did is I would ask them both in a sort of general or abstract sense what it means for morality to be objective, and with respect to concrete cases, like what does it mean to say abortion is objectively wrong? And I would ask them, what does objective mean here? And one of the things people would sometimes say, it wasn't that frequent, but they would sometimes say, well, it means like the facts about what's going on here are measurable. It's subject to some sort of inquiry or scrutiny or measurability. So that is a recognizable use of the term objective, but it's not what I take realists in the literature to be using the term objective to mean. What I take them to typically be using that term to mean is something like, it has to do with what it is that makes a proposition true or false. So it's what serves as the truth maker for a proposition. And it's specifically characterized in terms of its contrast with non-objective truth maker accounts, or accounts that reject that the claims in question are actually propositional at all. And so you typically get this sort of tripartite characterization of a putative proposition, like it's wrong to steal for fun. And you get the non-cognitivist account, which says that's not, it might look like a proposition, but it's not really a proposition. That's actually someone saying like stealing, boo. So you set those aside and you say, okay, well, what about the cognitivist accounts, which hold this as propositional? And you tend to get the relativistic ones or the stance-dependent ones, where that proposition is made true by attitudes or preferences in some way. So a straightforward example of this would be like if I said, I like chocolate cake. Now, if I say that, I'm making a statement about my preferences. And that statement is going to be objectively right or wrong in an uncontroversial way. But some normative discourse may drop the explicit use of indexical terminology like I. Like if I say I'm Lance, it's true. If someone else says, like if you say I'm Lance, it's false. So that I is serving as an indexical where the word I is referring to me when I say it and you when you say it. Now, if you drop that language and, you could have a language where someone just says, name is Lance. Now, I'm not saying my name is Lance, but it could be understood that if I go around saying name is Lance, people will understand that I'm saying me, especially if I go name Lance. Like people, you can index without having to use words. And so the relativistic accounts, or the stance-dependent accounts can take, well, I should specifically say the relativistic accounts, because relativism and stance dependence are technically orthogonal distinctions. But a lot of the relativistic accounts end up being a type of stance-dependent account. Anyway, if the language like chocolate cake is good is understood to implicitly index to me, it effectively functions to say, I think chocolate cake is good. And now that could be objectively true or false. It's objectively true or false in a way where it's just telling you something about my preferences, not what like the intrinsic properties of the cake are. It doesn't have intrinsic tastiness. I'm telling you, hey, I find it tasty. So you have accounts like that. And then you have accounts that what I understand realists to be doing is saying, that's not what I think moral language is doing. And it's not what I think is an appropriate way to characterize moral language. Proper moral language is not true relative to any particular frame of reference, any particular standard, whether it be a culture or an individual. It's not made true by attitudes or values or preferences. It's made true in some other way. And then it's up to the realist account to specify the way in which it's made true. So I see objectivity or stance independence in the realist terminology. What I'm rejecting is that there are facts about what's morally right or wrong or good or bad or whatever that are not made true by attitudes or values or preferences or something like that. And it's not really about measurability.
Okay, so you saw my other debate, but I guess now is probably a good time for me to kind of flesh out my game theoretic approach and see kind of what issues you have with that. So so I feel like okay, when I look at the social landscape, right? Like when I'm trying to figure out what's going on ontologically, I try to observe kind of the patterns, the macro patterns that are going on, and then I try to naturalistically reduce them, right? So like my metaethical stance would probably be reductive moral naturalism. So I see like these patterns of people engaging in what I would call moral activities, right? Moral debate, legal courts of justice, like mythological and entertainment movies and stuff it's kind of fleshing out moral principles in narrative. Like tons of money and effort and mind power is going into this umbrella of what seems to be morality, right? And like like sacrifice, like soldiers going to war for their country, like people like basically throwing away their lives for this concept of morality. So from a like from an evolutionary perspective, it seems like something important is going on here, something that's probably not evolutionarily arbitrary. And so trying to reduce it to its core essentials, trying to figure out what's going on here, my attempt to do that reduces morality to basically the interaction between biology and game theory. And so I would put game theory as, in terms of ontology, I would classify game theory as a mathematical ontology. And the biological component I would put in kind of like a sentience ontology. Like it's kind of a mix. Right? The well-being aspect is a sentience ontology, and then the mechanical aspect is a physics ontology. But there's kind of this synergy between three types of ontology, and this synergy, from my angle of analysis, it seems like this synergy is creating the phenomenon of morality. And I think there are interesting patterns, potentially measurable / calculable patterns to this ontology. So what do you think about all that?
Well, I'd like to hear this developed more. There's specific questions I could ask, like what would be a specific example, but a few things that might help our audience. I'm a little bit familiar with game theory. I also, in anticipation of the discussion, I used an image of like a person in a prison to represent the prisoner's dilemma as the thumbnail, because that's the most famous like game theoretic problem. So it might help if you give a little background on what is game theory, and maybe what is it, if you think it's helpful, what the prisoner's dilemma is in particular, maybe tit for tat. So just so people have a sense of like what is game theory and how is that relevant to morality?
Right. Let me see if I can remember the details of the prisoner's dilemma. It's something like there's two prisoners in a jail cell, and the interrogator is trying to get details out of them if they work together on this crime. And the interrogator, he's asking one of the criminals, like, if you rat out the other guy, then we'll give you a lesser sentence in jail. So there's a reward, right? Rat out your partner, and we reduce your punishment. And both of them get a reduced punishment, so they're going to rat each other out. But then there's this thing: if both of them rat each other out, then there's no reward for either of them. And then if neither of them rat out each other, then it's maximal punishment, basically. And so like the punishment structure, like the interrogator is trying to create a punishment structure that motivates ratting each other out, right? It's like within your utilitarian interest to tell the truth, confess, and get the other guy, punished. And so like basically that approach to game theory, it's trying to hijack our innate reward punishment sensibilities to try to manipulate us, right? But the tit for tat example is a common evolutionary game theory or game theoretic strategy, right? So one thing that's important to understand is that game theory is simultaneously the entire category of, it's the study of how to optimize a game, right? So games, when you're in a game, you've got the goal of winning the game, and then there are strategies to navigate towards winning the goal. And then the game theory is studying what are the best navigational approaches to winning the game. And in evolution, people who study evolution, they try to think about evolution like a game so they can better understand how creatures are navigating this space. And they use software to do simulations. And tit for tat has been simulated in software in a variety of ways that have been pretty interesting. And the way it's commonly simulated is there's different agents. So an important way to think about agents is agents are entities that have goals. So a character in a game would be an agent. And so within the software simulation, they create these little agents, and the agents interact with each other, and the agents are trying to win the game. And what happens is the agents, they can harm each other and they can benefit each other. And they try to figure out what strategies are successful in these software simulations, and they find that tit for tat is consistently a successful strategy. And tit for tat is basically, if you hurt me, I hurt you, and if you're good to me, I'm good to you, right? And so it's creating pressure on harm, right? So like, if everyone is super if everyone is super cooperative, then like maybe the abusive strategy will start to dominate. But then the tit for tat, it evolves like this revenge mentality, and that revenge mentality puts the pressure on the abusive mentalities, so they can't get too much power, and it kind of equalizes the playing field between the agents, and that's why that's why it's kind of successful. Is that good enough, or should I go deeper on that?
Sure. Yeah. The Prisoner's Dilemma reflects one type of potential game theoretic situation, and the way I understand game theories is that it's looking at what happens when two or more agents with goals come into conflict with one another, such that there are potential trade-offs based on different sort of decision paths that they could take. Where if I cooperate, a lot of them are framed in terms of cooperate versus defect. If I cooperate, I get this decision payoff, and if I defect, I get this decision payoff. But the hitch with it is that what your payoff is contingent in part on what the other agent or agents decide to do. And this can create this sort of recursive problem where it's like, okay, well, if I do this, then I would get this, but only if if I cooperate and they cooperate, that's the best situation. But if I cooperate and they defect, they get the best payout and I get the worst outcome. And so since I know that, I don't want to cooperate and then get, stabbed in the back. So maybe I should defect. Oh, but if I defect and they defect, that's actually worse than if we both cooperate. And so you kind of get stuck in this loop where what you do is partially contingent on what they do. And then you have to think about what they would do, and they're thinking about what you would do. And basically you have this issue where you get into these really tricky problems where, because what it's rational for you to do turns in part on what it's rational for others to do, but the same is true for them. You have to do your best to try to navigate these, decision spaces, knowing that you have others that are trying to anticipate what you'll do, and you're trying to anticipate what they'll do, presumably under conditions of uncertainty. Otherwise you would know if you know exactly what they're going to do, then there's no problem. So it creates these really fascinating, tricky situations, and I understand game theory to hopefully, at least in principle, translate to real life in some way. So it's these sort of very structured abstractions that step outside the real world and are in a world where the decision payouts are very precise. They could be known in advance. There's all these like what in potential you would get contingent on a certain set of considerations. But of course, in the real world, things are a lot messier. And I take it that part of the idea is to say, okay, well, if we can understand the sort of broad abstract outlines of what's going on in game theoretic situations and these sort of hypothetical spaces, hopefully we can translate that into understanding how rational agents can and perhaps should operate under real world circumstances. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly how I'm thinking of it. It's there's like this mathematical space supervenes on reality, and that's why like mathematical concepts are often useful such that we can make discoveries based on math, right? So like from an ontological perspective, like the number 7 doesn't seem to exist, but like the fact that we can discover things via mathematical principles shows that there's something objective to this mathematical framework. And I think the same thing is useful about game theory. It exists in this mathematical ontology, and it's providing us discoverable things that theoretically would be very beneficial.
Okay. And how can we move from discussion of game theory to how this gets us to some type of moral realism?
Yeah, so basically mathematical truths are mind independent or stance independent. That's why they're discoverable. For thousands of years, people didn't understand that black holes are real. And then Einstein's relativity opened up the door for us to discover the mathematical truth of black holes. And once we discovered the mathematical truth of black holes, then we pointed our telescopes and we found out that mathematical truth supervenes on reality, which is to say that they're connected. It's hard to describe. Supervenience is basically one thing exists on top of the other such that changes in one thing lead to changes in the other. And so there's kind of a predictable relationship between the two. So we find the mathematical truths, and that leads us to find the physical truths, because the mathematical principles are based on the same, physical principles are based on the same mathematical principles, which makes the deducibility, makes them parallel in deducibility. Was that coherent enough?
Somewhat. I mean, I don't know if I want to like break it down indefinitely, but
yeah. So, okay.
Okay. So how do, like, I guess just continue on with, because I want to get from game theory to how we get to moral realism. So, and you're welcome to take, get there how you wish.
Sure. So yeah, basically, I think that the moral project is dealing with what ought we to do, right? And when we're dealing with oughts, I view oughts in relation to goals, and I think that's a common way to think about morality. Once you have a goal, then it creates this navigation problem, which is how ought we accomplish the goal? And there could be a variety of ways of accomplishing the goal, and that's where game theory comes in. Game theory is studying all the different ways to accomplish the goal, and it's trying to calculate the most optimal pathway. And so when we're aiming at a goal, we, by almost axiomatically, we ought to do the optimal pathway, right? That's how you accomplish the goal, is through the optimal pathway. And so then the question is, well, do goals exist? Do oughts exist? Like, I guess this comes back to a semantic thing, but I think that once you have agents, then you by default have goals. If agents exist, then goals exist. If goals exist, oughts exist. If oughts exist, morality exists. So it just kind of, it's all downstream from that. And agents come from, the brute fact of nature. Like, agents evolve out of nature, and the goals are just built into the structure of the agent, right? And so, there's the issue of the is-ought gap. To me, the is-ought gap is kind of a red herring of sorts. And the way I like to approach this is-ought gap is there's two ways to look at the problem. There's the logical lens, then there's the ontological lens, right? And the logical lens, it's doing the deductive, the analytic philosophy. It's like, okay, I have an is premise and I have an ought conclusion. Oh, that's a fallacy. And it's like, okay, I got to put an ought premise in there. Now it's ought, is, conclusion, ought. It's like, yay. But then you just take the problem back. It's like, where did that premise of ought come from? We need another ought, and you get this infinite regress problem. And then the whole concept of an ought looks ridiculous. And it's like, maybe oughts don't even exist because there's no primordial ought. And so what are we talking about here? But I feel like that's not a useful way to look at oughts, right? Like, going back to the semantic issue, it's like, what is useful? Like, if we define oughts as like something that doesn't have infinite regress, we're basically defining oughts out of existence. And now we have a word that has no meaning. It's like, well, that's not useful. We have a word that's meaningless and incoherent. How about we try to figure out like what oughts are doing in our society, and then maybe that's a more useful approach to the definition of an ought, right? And so in society, it seems like the ought is in relation to navigating this goal space. And so just because we can't find the initial primordial ought, it doesn't negate the fact that we have goals. And so for me, the appropriate way to view the is-ought gap is like there's just the brute fact of existence, right? We've got the Big Bang, like here we are, we're thrown into the universe, like surprise. We don't know why, this is a brute fact, right? And then like there's a derivable brute fact is like we evolved, like the principles of this universe are basically, there's kind of this existence-based principle. There's entropy, right? Entropy kind of dissolves different structures. And then like that entropy puts like it puts pressure on the laws of physics to basically only the structures that can resist entropy are able to persist, right? And so that entropy creates a kind of telos on physics. So now like atoms are trying to form negentropic structures so they can persist, because otherwise entropy destroys everything. And so it just so happens to be the case that like negentropic structures evolve, right? Abiogenesis is just chemistry that like starts to resist entropy, because everything that doesn't resist entropy gets destroyed and you're just left with the negentropic randomness. And that creates a selection pressure, and that selection pressure evolves up into agents. And guess what? Like the agents they inherit that goal of existence. It's just kind of a natural aspect built into the framework of the universe. And so to me, it seems a little bit pointless to try to resist that fact. It's like, welcome to the universe. We were built by processes that are based on existence. That existence is within us as a telos. And so now all of our goals are related to those fundamental principles, right? So the fundamental principle is, or the fundamental ought is basically, I ought to exist. That's basic. If you try to go down the chain of oughts, like logically, it kind of backs up into that ought. And I don't think you can go deeper than that one. So as long as we can accept that primordial ought, then we can kind of build up an objective framework of morality on that foundation. And so just to make that a little bit more coherent, like bacteria would have this, I ought to exist, and therefore they eat food. And then like creatures evolve more complicated oughts. It's like, well, biological creatures, they ought to survive, they ought to reproduce. Those are just two different ways of existing, right? And persisting in existence over time. And then like creatures evolve to be more complex. So now they're like social creatures. And in order for social creatures to exist, like these more varieties of oughts, like these are derivative oughts, right? Like we ought to cooperate. Well, that's like a social ought. It's like, I exist if the group exists, and therefore I ought to exist, therefore the group ought to exist, because the group is the vehicle for my existence, and therefore I ought to do these things to help maintain the existence of the group. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about in this moral space reduces to these social oughts, and those social oughts reduce down to I ought to exist. And and all of that space is basically navigatable with game theoretic mathematics, which are stance independent.
Okay, there's a lot there, and I'm not sure what the best thing to focus on is. I think one of the things I'd like to focus on is something that you had said early on in that characterization. Is you said something like, if you have agents, you have goals, and if I understand an agent just to be like a goal-directed entity, like an entity that is trying to achieve objectives, that doesn't strike me as an issue. Like, I don't even know what it's like. So if an agent makes choices and deliberates, well, how would it deliberate or make choices unless there's some standard or goal, or there's some way for it to, there has to be some sort of set of considerations over which it weighs one choice or one set of actions against another by some standard. So I don't have an issue with that. Where I start to get concerned is when, okay, so if we say, if there's agents, you got goals. I'm fine with that. But then when you say, if you have goals, you have oughts, that's where I start to be a little worried. I can understand how to characterize a goal in very rough, sort of crude, cognitive, psychological terms. So like, organisms have like approach avoid tendencies, even like single-celled organisms do. But, people will, I try to avoid touching hot stoves, or try to, if I see a croissant, I'm going to approach it. I'm going to try to eat it, which can be a problem.
Found your weakness.
Yeah. So we have tendencies to move through and navigate through space, and they're deeply rooted to a significant extent in the fact that we are evolved organisms. And so you have all these factors that shape the behavior of an organism in an approach and avoid way. And I could see goals as being understood as an abstract characterization of the set of patterns of behavioral patterns of an organism, such that it operates over a whole bunch of whatever types of cognitive processes going on. They don't even have to be cognitive processes. Some straightforward mechanical processes and cells and stuff, where and in those cases, I don't know if I would really say that a cell has a goal. I might say that it has a goaloid, or it has goal-ish behavior. But goals I see in humans have there's something cognitive going on, in the sense that they have a nervous system that's processing information. It's taking in sensory inputs. They're doing more than a cell is. And maybe it's a matter of degree, and there's no sharp dividing line. Maybe there's some threshold. I don't know that we need to get into giving some sort of precise operational definition of a goal in perfect cognitive scientific terms, but I see goals very roughly as something psychological, and that can be understood through psychological inquiry. And so we could study human behavior and say, hey, that person clearly has the goal of getting out of the rain. How do you know that they have the goal of getting out of the rain? Well, because when it started raining, they threw up an umbrella and they immediately ran towards an indoor space or under a tree or something. So you can infer their goals from their behavior. That's roughly how I see us figuring out what the goals of agents are: observing their behavior, forming theories, detecting patterns in seemingly goal-directed behavior. And all that strikes me as fine. Now, I'm also fine with the use, and I agree with you, when we look at the is-ought gap, there's that sort of pure logical sense, because logic is conservative. If it's going to be in the conclusion, it's got to be somewhere in the premises. And so you have that sort of basic version of the is-ought gap that's not very interesting, because that's just how logic works in general. I think Kane B, I don't know if you watch Kane B's channel. Do you? Yeah. So Kane B has the hedgehog, if hedgehogs are in the conclusion, you got to have hedgehogs in the premises. It's just a general feature of the way logic works. We could set that one aside. And you got into the other one. Now, I don't know if I think that there's a more robust and substantive notion of an is-ought gap, but I do think that there would be something troubling if conventional use of ought discourse, like everyday life, people say, hey, you should really move if you're not happy where you're living, or hey, you ought to go to the bank, you ought to try to get a new job. We use this language, so we can ask the question of what people are doing in those contexts. Now, I think that that's a separate question from what I take analytic philosophers to be doing. And analytic philosophers, I think, will often take perfectly functional, useful, meaningful, everyday discourse and completely ruin it. And I really, really don't like what they do. Now, I understand you're not doing what they're doing, but again, I have to emphasize, my position is a reaction to what I take analytic philosophers to be doing. And I take a lot of issues with what they're doing. And so if I have really harsh criticisms of what they're doing, it may or may not apply to your accounts, your categories, and your distinctions. I take a real issue with what they're doing because, among other things, they'll talk about normative reasons. And then I ask them, what is a normative reason? And they'll say, well, it's a reason that counts in favor. And then if I say, what do you mean by counts in favor? They're like, I can't really explain it to you. It's unanalyzable. You just get it. I don't think that there are meaningful but incommunicable concepts. And so that, to me, is an immediate, massive red flag. They think people have reasons, and the reasons count in favor. Is that a metaphor? I mean, if it's literal, it's counting in favor. I don't know how it could be literal. If it's metaphorical.
My moral intuition is 3 points for Gryffindor, and yours is only 2 points.
Exactly.
What are we talking about?
Right, counting in favor. If someone said, "Hey," the point, you could talk about a scoreboard in principle, and notice measurability is a relevant factor there, which relates back to something that you said. If you mean that in the literal sense, I can understand you, but they don't mean it in a literal sense. So what sense do they mean it in? I don't know. And I actually think that the reason I don't know is because there isn't any sense in that what they're saying is meaningful. I don't think it's meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what they're doing is something that Wittgenstein pointed out, and that what other philosophers have pointed out, ordinary language philosophers and others. I think that analytic philosophers have become so obsessed with language that they get tripped up over words, tripped up over literal matters of grammar and syntax of the English language, and they dupe themselves into reifying incomplete sentences into thinking that they're capturing special abstractions and properties that aren't really there. And I think it's kind of ridiculous that I think that they're doing that, but I'm not the first person to observe or notice this. I actually think statements like, you shouldn't hurt people just for fun, would only make sense if they were conditionalized with respect to a goal or a standard. Now, you might actually agree with that, but for me, but what a lot of non-naturalist realists are getting at is those statements are unconditional. That's the whole dang point of a realist account, is that they're not conditional. You ought not hurt people for fun unconditionally, simpliciter. There's nothing further to say. To me, that almost sounds like an incomplete sentence. Like if someone said, hey, you should put the shoes. The shoes where? Like you didn't finish the sentence. Right. For me, one of the things that I noticed that philosophers do, and again, the reason I talk about philosophers is because I want to make clear what it is I'm rejecting when I call myself an anti-realist. Because if I end up just saying, hey, I don't have a problem with what you're talking about, maybe those facts are real, I want to be able to say, nevertheless, I do think it makes sense to call myself a moral anti-realist, because I'm an anti-realist with respect to these other views over here, not with respect to your views. I might not be an anti-realist about your views. I might take a different position, like some type of quietism or some type of I prefer not to use language that way ism. And that's, I prefer not to use language that way is not saying your position is false or unintelligible. It's saying that's not how I want to carve up the conceptual space. And I don't think we might just be okay with one another having that position. Anyway, so I think that that's something that has happened to a lot of these realist accounts that are out there. And I think a big factor in that is the way that they use language, like ought. So the main issue that I take issue with among non-naturalist moral realists is what I call irreducible normativity. So on my view, there are only descriptive facts. Now, when I say that there are only descriptive facts, that might sound bizarre, because don't I say things like, you shouldn't hurt people? And the answer is yes, I do say that. And so if I thought that there were only descriptive facts, someone might say, well, then why would you say people shouldn't hurt people? That's not a descriptive fact, that's a prescriptive fact. Now, on my view, I see prescriptive facts as only making sense if they're understood as a type, a subcategory of descriptive facts. And I characterize them in terms of relations between means and ends. And so I think that there are a certain type of stance-independent fact. There are facts about conditional on some goal. There is some fact about the means of achieving that goal. And it could be pluralistic. It could be, there are 6 ways. Like, let's say you are thirsty and your goal is to not be thirsty. That doesn't mean that there's only one thing to do, which is drink that glass of water over there. You could go to the store and buy Gatorade. You could drink milk. You could find a local lake and jump in and start drinking the water in the lake like a weirdo. There's all sorts of ways of achieving the goal. So there would be some fact of the matter about what actions would achieve the goal and what actions wouldn't achieve those goals. So I do think there's facts like that. And I use normative language to refer to those facts. And so from your description, the other thing I would just add too is, given game theory, there are also definitely going to be optimal strategies relative to goals. So if I know what my goals are, I just introspect, I have my goals. If I know what my goals are, I know what your goals are, we're in a conflict, and I know that I could either cooperate or defect, there may actually be a fact of the matter about what, relative to my goals, will on average yield the best payoff. What is the best decision for me to make with respect to my goals? And so what I'm perfectly willing to grant is all of that there are game theoretic optimums relative to goals, that there are facts about what the better and worse ways of achieving goals are relative to those goals. And so granting all that, I'm not sure how much we disagree. Like, the stuff I'm rejecting might just be stuff you reject too.
Yeah, it sounds like, yeah, based on like our understanding of reality is very similar. Like you said, it's almost like how do we want to use language is the main disagreement. It sounds like you're almost like using language to combat the realists that are corrupting the landscape, and you're positioning yourself to kind of go after that. And I guess maybe I'm positioning myself to kind of go against the arbitrariness. Would I guess I view like moral arbitrariness as something undesirable, and this measurable, goal-oriented approach to morality seems to resolve that problem in a coherent way ontologically.
That's where we might have some disagreements. So, so a couple questions I want to ask, but I guess I'll just move to the arbitrariness one. It may be that I'm okay with just saying, yeah, values are arbitrary, and I may end up endorsing a view that you're not happy with or you disagree with. I always find difficulty when someone says, what does arbitrary mean? I think it's actually a challenging term to characterize. Do you have a way, like, do you have that same issue, or do you have a way of characterizing it? Because maybe it would help to just unpack what arbitrary is.
In this context, I'm thinking of, when I say arbitrary, I'm thinking of something like random and baseless and unpredictable, right? And so I don't view morality as random, baseless, or unpredictable. I evolve it as a process that was, specifically selected towards different ends, right? And so because there was a selection process on whatever morality is, there are predictable aspects to it. And those predictable aspects bring us into this mathematical space where certain things could be discovered, right? We could discover that there is a better way to do morality, right? So for years and years, tribalism meant genociding your neighbors. And like, we discovered a better strategy, which is cooperation with your neighbors. It's like, wow, the world is way better when we, share, when we trade, international trade and, international travel and international food. That's all way better than tribalism, right? We discovered a new type of strategy that optimizes existence in a much more favorable way that doesn't lead to self-extinction when some other tribe gets you back for your brutality, right?
Okay, so here's where I would start to have some concerns about this. So in terms of values not being like random, baseless, unpredictable, sure, that's all fine, but it does seem like it's possible for agents to have values, and for the sort of payoff matrix for their game theoretic choices that are available to them could favor them, as far as I could tell, doing something. And I know this came up in your previous debate, like with some specific examples of like bad, like actions you and I would probably agree are bad and we don't want them to happen. So let's just say hypothetically, there is a very powerful being like Thanos or something. And this being can do pretty much whatever they want. And because they're super powerful, and they decide that they want to, they want to destroy planets. They want to eat people. They're just like, I'm going to go to Earth and eat everyone, even if it takes 1,000,000 years. And let's say they have the power to do it. And so they look over all the range of options they have available to them. They really reflected on their values, and they're like, yep, totally want to eat all the people on Earth. And yep, I totally could do it. And there's almost no chance they could resist or stop me. And then they go ahead and do it. Do you think that being is making a mistake? Are they making a factual mistake? Are they doing something you would consider wrong? Because I would say that that's wrong. That seems wrong to me. I don't want everybody on Earth to get eaten. But if they're like calculating, like if they're using some rational decision procedure where they're trying to optimize for goal success, that might actually be the thing that is most conducive to their goals.
Yes. Okay. That's a great example. And this is kind of complicated. There's probably 3 different layers that I want to articulate in order to kind of help conceptualize my answer to this problem. So one thing I like to talk about is when talking about ontology, right, there's kind of this dichotomy between reductionism and emergentism. And reductionism kind of reduces to the parts, and emergentism focuses and emphasizes the whole, right? So if you're oriented towards the whole versus the parts, that's the dichotomy. And so when thinking about morality, I often think about what are the fundamentals, right? The fundamentals of morality would be the parts, and the whole would be like the moral conclusion, right? So that's an emergent that's an emergent morality. So what am I saying? Maybe I'm not. Let me make this more clear with an example. The fundamentals of morality are the units of well-being, and the units of well-being are pain and pleasure. Like if we were to take morality and say, what are the parts? I would say morality is built on a substrate of pleasure and pain. Those are the units of this moral structure, right? And so creatures, they evolve to harness these units. And so when a creature says X is good, what's happening is that creature says, oh, X, for me, X has all these well-being units, and therefore it's good. So it's a utilitarian calculation that emerges from aggregating the parts of these units of well-being. Is that coherent so far?
It is, yes.
So when the creature says, I think eating all humans in existence is good, that creature is doing this utilitarian calculation that says, oh, this gives me all this utility. And so that's a very relativistic type of morality, which I grant, right? I grant that that's relativistic. But there is also this fundamental aspect, which is when that creature is harming all these other humans, in order to obtain its utility, it's harming all these other creatures' utility. So from the view from nowhere, there's a fundamental immorality to this landscape. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. I'm familiar with people proposing a kind of view from nowhere, but on my view, I don't think there is or could be a view from nowhere in principle. I take everything to be perspectival. And so I don't even know what it would mean for there to be like something to be wrong from a view from nowhere.
Well, okay. Oh, that's an interesting objection. Wouldn't it be a stance-independent truth that there are multiple humans who have their well-being harmed by this entity? Wouldn't that be a stance-independent truth?
I would say yes. I should caveat, though, that technically, on my view, since I'm a pragmatist about these sorts of things, I'm a sort of perspectivalist all the way down. So even that sort of fact, when I'm using stance independent there, I don't take it to have the ontological import that your sort of mainstream analytic philosopher would, because I don't endorse like a correspondence theory of truth. And so there's a variety of ways in which my own personal views depart from a lot of the mainstream views. Nevertheless, I would say for all practical purposes, like I think there's trees, I think there's people, and I would generally agree, yeah, it's stance independently true that if like a Thanos being came to Earth and started eating everybody, that they're all suffering. Like, of course, I'm going to agree to that. So I'll say, yeah, that's a stance independent fact.
Okay. So, yeah, so this landscape involves one creature getting all this utility and a bunch of other creatures getting a bunch of detriment. And you asked me to judge that, right? So you're asking me to use my moral intuitions to judge that. Where did my moral intuitions come from? They come from my evolution, right? Whether it's nature versus nurture, it's all selected for. And I'm using my intuitions to say, I don't like this unequal landscape of utility. I like a more equanimous, I'm butchering that word, an equal landscape of utility. That doesn't seem fair. In my moral instincts, I have an instinct to like fairness, and this example violates my instinct. You know what I mean? So I'm using my reductive morality to judge this.
Well, but so I'm doing that too, but I'm doing it as an anti-realist. So I'm looking at the situation of this being that wants to eat everybody on Earth, and I'm saying, I consider that bad. I don't approve of that. I don't want that to happen. And in every case, what I'm doing is telling you something about my goals and values, but I'm not adopting a view from nowhere.
Right. But so I guess what I was talking about earlier, I don't think my intuitions are arbitrary, right? And my intuitions are not random. There's a pattern to where my intuitions come from. And that pattern shows me what my goals are. And so if I have a goal for justice, that gives us an interesting landscape of, well, how do we optimize for justice? Are we being fair to other countries? Are we being fair to other species? That presents what I think is a valuable landscape of consideration that's not random and should be analyzed for optimality. I think that's a word.
Yeah, so I'm okay with navigating that space. So, but I think that can be grounded in shared or intersubjective values. So, if you get a group of people together and they want to build a house, there's going to be facts about what's going to constitute a good house or a bad house relative to the sort of biological and comfort needs of that group of people. But I don't think that there's any further fact such that like they ought to build a house independent of whether they want to build a house or whether it would serve their interest to build a house. And I typically take, and again, to reference back to the academic literature, what at the very least non-naturalist realists want is to say there's some fact of the matter about whether they ought to build a house or ought not build a house that is true independent of their goals. And so I'm rejecting that, but I don't have an issue with saying, hey, if a group of people want to build a house, there's going to be facts about what will or will not be conducive to doing so. The caveat with that is if some monster comes out of the woods and says, I want to eat all of the people, that's the only thing I want to do, I don't think it's making any factual mistakes if it goes ahead and eats everybody. And so, that's why my position ends up, I think, meaningfully being called some type of anti-realist position. I don't think beings that you and I would agree were horrible monsters that we would hope don't exist or would be stopped if they do exist are making factual errors when they act in accordance with their horrific actions. I object to their actions, and I'm glad I'm assuming you do, and you would object to their actions, but I don't think we're referencing facts independent of our goals and standards. I take myself to be expressing my attitudes, and that's basically it.
Okay, so I think that now would be a good time to talk about biological drives. And I think you would probably be way more of an expert than me on this topic since you have a PhD in psychology?
I do. My area is social psychology. So, psychology, there's a lot of sub areas, and I may or may not be knowledgeable about, any particular issue in psychology. I mean, stuff gets very narrow.
Sure. So my understanding of like the neuroscience of how this works is that basically the psychology is basically a slave to the biology, which is to say the cognition is serving the biological drives. So the biological drives provide the goals, and the psychology is trying to figure out how to accomplish the goals. Does that seem accurate, or you take issue with that?
I probably would take issue with that. Okay. So I think humans are a little unusual in terms of organisms. And one of the things that I think humans, like if you were to ask like what's a bird good at, it's going to depend on the bird, but birds are often good at flying. Like they have a sort of adaptive niche. They're good at particular sorts of things. They avoid predators by going places the predators can't get to. Other organisms have different defense mechanisms. Obviously, a porcupine is not going to fly away. It's going to defend itself with spikes, spines, or quills, whatever specifically they're called. Different organisms are adapted to different sort of lifestyles, and they're good at certain sorts of things and not so good at other sorts of things. I think the human niche, like what humans are good at, is cultural transmission. And so we've got this big old sponge up here. And what humans are good at is they live in pro-social groups. They pass on information about how to extract resources from their environment, to build tools, to build, and not just physical tools. We don't just make clothes and build houses and modify our environment. We build social structures, normative systems and institutions. We build legal codes and methods of interacting and languages. So we build all these structures and artifacts and inventions, both social inventions and physical inventions, to modify our environment and modify one another. We are masters of adaptation and change, and that's largely facilitated through brains that are adapted to a sort of cultural apprenticeship. So Kim Sterelny has this wonderful book called The Evolved Apprentice. And it's one of my favorite books on this topic. It's a fairly short book. I think he has a newer book that's a lot bigger. Great book, where he talks about this sort of apprenticeship feature being an important part of human evolution, where you live in a small group, and it's important for the older members of a particular society to pass on the information to future generations. And so I see humans as adapted to what you could ultimately say is the cultural niche. We transmit information from one generation to the next. And the big advantage is that it's cumulative. So it's cumulative cultural evolution is what I think the big driving factor and what makes humans so much different, so much more different from non-human animals is that, humans are biologically basically the same as we were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago. And yet the way we're living right now is radically different from the way we were living like pre-agricultural times. So humans have these really interesting brains, and those brains can do things that I don't see as so rigidly locked to their underlying biology. Like I'm not stuck only acting so as to enhance my reproductive fitness. Many people opt not to have children. They employ various methods of contraception. They do things that are fundamentally at odds with what one might think would be in their reproductive interest. Now, it's possible to argue that all of those actions are ultimately built on a foundation of underlying psychological systems that did, in fact, emerge because they were adaptive from a natural selection point of view. And I think that there's a sense in which that's probably true. So there may be a sense in which if I squint, I'd be like, okay, sure. Humans are always optimizing from a natural selection perspective to be adaptive. But human behavior is so subject to modification and change. I think it starts to strain what that exactly entails, because you really do have individuals that act so far out of alignment with what could plausibly be understood to be in their reproductive interests. I don't know. Maybe I think it might make sense to think of humans as possibly being somewhat anomalous with respect to conventional biological imperatives. I'm not saying I'm absolutely convinced of that, but I think humans are a tough case.
Yeah, I agree with that. Humans are complicated. I'm trying to figure out if I want to address those examples or go a different route. So okay, with the biological reproduction, the way I usually think about it is, well, first of all, like contraception is a relatively novel invention, so we're probably not adapted for so much self-selection, right? So that might change as evolution adapts to our own self-selection capabilities. But I think for human evolution, I feel like the survival of the genes, right? Largely we're very social and, like you said, cultural. I feel like oftentimes we're more focused on the survival of the goal of the group than we are the survival of the individual. That's why we're obsessed with stories of heroes. Heroes, they're throwing away themselves for the group, right? It doesn't make sense at the level of individual selection, but it makes sense at this group selection level. And so if we're a very groupish species, then to me it makes sense to not super care about oh, I got to mate with as many people as possible. It's actually it's more important to ensure the stability of this group, which is investing in culture, getting better moral practices, right? Which is, to me, that's equivalent, or it reduces to getting a better game theoretic strategy for this group, right? Okay, back to this drive thing. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. So there's this phenomenon of psychological regret, right? And so when I think about psychological regret, the way I interpret it is that maybe there's a biological drive that has a more long-term perspective, and the psychology, so there's a gap between biology and psychology, or there's a gap between deeper values and superficial values. And maybe the superficial values or the cognition, it optimizes for a short-term strategy. So it's the short-term brain is ooh, here's an opportunity to screw someone over. I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity for a short-term benefit. And then after you do it, then the regret kicks in And to me, I interpret that as the voice of long-term strategy. And the voice of long-term strategy is punishing you and saying, hey, you're engaging in dangerous behavior. This could start a tit for tat cycle. This could induce revenge. Hey, don't do that anymore because I'm focusing on the long terms, not the short term. Does that seem fair, or you have a different
Yeah,
perspective?
I think that's plausible. I would just add that like guilt mechanisms are probably due in part not just to facilitate more long-term thinking, which strikes me as plausible, although I don't know of any specific research, but also in part to help reinforce and stabilize whatever socially constructed normative system you have in a particular society. So if the society says X is wrong and Y is good, you might feel guilt for doing the former and not the latter because you've learned that. Now, I also think there's probably an underlying degree. It's not like the values that societies build are completely random or arbitrary. Specific things are reliably going to be the things that emerge as the things we feel guilty about, the things we don't feel guilty about. Probably there's biological factors, probably sociocultural factors there too.
Right. So I guess to tie that to the earlier point, I guess the earlier point was something like, I guess the point is that it's possible to be morally wrong. And I guess what I'm getting at is this type of regret is a signal of like moral incorrectness with respect to your deeper goals. Does that make sense?
It does, but I don't see it as an indication of being mistaken any more than I would see like a stomach ache as a mistake. It's, some feature of the way your brain happens to work. But, let's say a person could get opt in, like it's like cyberpunk 2088 or whatever, and you could opt into like cyber surgery to remove your guilt system. Now you don't feel guilt. Like, are you not making a mistake now, or would it be a mistake to get that removed? Like, I just see that's just like some biological system. I don't see it as indicative of anything that a person's making an error or not making an error about.
Okay, so I guess that points back to the fundamentals, which when I'm reducing morality, I'm reducing it down to I ought to exist, right? And so if you exist within the paradigm of I ought to exist, if you change your brain such that you're sabotaging your own existence, in a sense, you're violating your deepest goal, if that makes sense. And so from the perspective of that deepest goal, that would be immoral.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think it's like rationally obligatory for an agent to have that goal. And I said one, but then I guess there's only one. What I wanted to mention was something from Rick and Morty. Maybe you've seen that, like the Meeseeks. So they have basically, they could produce these beings that their sole purpose is to try to stop existing by performing the task that's been assigned to them. And those beings actually are like trying to not exist. I don't, I would prefer to talk in those like hypothetical terms because I don't like to talk about humans in these terms because it's a sensitive matter. But like the Meeseeks, like they're actually striving to stop existing. Now, I think that's kind of sad and tragic and unfortunate. I don't like that whole situation is deeply disturbing and upsetting. Rick and Morty is great at constructing scenarios like that, but I don't know that they're like factually mistaken in pursuit of those goals. Not because I want them to exist or not. It has nothing to do with my values. It just has to do with how I view goals. Like, I just don't see agents as requiring or necessarily having any specific goals. I think any goals that are logically possible are possible goals for an agent to have, and it doesn't require the goal of existing. Now, an agent that doesn't have the goal to exist will probably very quickly in almost every circumstance stop existing because it's not trying to preserve itself. But I see that as a descriptive fact, not a fact about what its goals like ought to be or are or anything like that. So you could have an agent in principle. That's why I brought up the example of Meeseeks that actually doesn't have the goal of existing and in fact has the goal of not existing. And it can take like rational decisions, like instrumentally rational decisions in pursuit of that goal. I don't see it as making any mistakes there. Like, it's not getting the facts about anything wrong. And it's because I don't think of goals as an appropriate subject of evaluation. I simply see them as psychological facts about an agent. Very much like, like I have a favorite color. Like, my favorite color is purple. Like, I don't think I could be incorrect about that. That's just And so I see this. I see all goals that way. Their goals are just psychological facts about agents. It almost seems to me like a category mistake to think of goals as being potentially erroneous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, this does get us quite rapidly into sensitive territory. So I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that.
Yeah, and it might be best to avoid it. I try to avoid like sensitive topics, and so the whole thing about existence is a challenging one to navigate without going there. So definitely do if you talk about it. Let's try to be mindful of that, but we may want to move on to something else.
Yeah. I guess I think that often when we introspect deeply, like sometimes superficially, there can be desires, but if we introspect deep enough, we might find deeper desires that can be motivating in a different direction. And so, yeah, and sometimes I feel like the deeper desires are, they're more fundamental and often, I don't know, I guess I lean towards the more correct and more worthy of following, if that makes sense.
It does. I get that sense. So, if a person is both a smoker and someone that doesn't want to smoke, there's a sense in both which they could simultaneously desire to smoke and desire to not smoke. And it's not like it's just a contradiction. It's like they have like a hierarchy, but I don't even see it as a strict hierarchy. I see that as a qualitative difference that doesn't, like, we don't understand, at least I don't, human psychology well enough to really get a sense of exactly what's going on in that sort of whole motivational system. But people do have competing drives, and there's stuff you could ask that person. Like, ideally, like, you could push a button and you would lose any desire to smoke. Would you push that button? I think a lot of those people say, yeah, absolutely. Of course, I would prefer not to smoke. And so there is a sense in which one of those goals, the goal to not smoke, in most cases at least, will typically be more fundamental. And I can kind of get the sense of, like, saying that that's more correct in a certain kind of sense, but I don't think it's like stance independently correct. What I would, and that's why I would probably avoid the language of correctness. What I would say is it's more sort of it's more central to that person's sort of a fundamental or overarching framework for what kind of life they want to live. And I think that would be adequate in characterizing it, without having to suppose that the goal is in some sense correct.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. But I guess it leads me to think about the Laplacian element of morality. I think I mentioned Laplace's demon in my other debate. And so basically, Laplace's demon is basically this hypothetical, like, omniscient entity that is able to understand all the particles in the universe. It knows all the forces. It can predict all the trajectories. And so, like, for me, when I'm thinking about this stance-independent morality, I guess the ultimate appeal is to this. You could basically put a mindless AI. You could substitute Laplace's demon for a mindless AI, right? So this is just a calculation algorithm, right? It's got all the data and is producing these calculations stance independently, mind independently, omnisciently. It's able to calculate all these agents. It's able to calculate that these agents have goals. It's able to calculate that these goals give them trajectories. And it's able to calculate that some of the agents' trajectories are less optimal than others, right? And so when I think about this Laplacian AI, to me, that provides kind of a sense of reductive naturalistic objectivity to this moral space. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that seems totally fine to me, but I see the facts that it's identifying as descriptive facts. And so if one wants to call a certain subset of descriptive facts the moral facts, they can do that. I think I would just wonder why we should do that and why call that a type of realism rather than call it something else. With this terminology, like moral realism or moral objectivity, exists within a particular timeline of social history in which any invocation of this terminology is going to invariably bear the vestiges of that history. It'd be very much like if I wanted to give some vindication of a concept of God that was fundamentally like non-agentic, it didn't make decisions, it wasn't anything like the Christian God or typical conceptions of theism. I would have to ask, like, what would the motivation for that be? Why use terminology that would put your position under the umbrella of a bunch of other positions that you probably don't hold, rather than just giving it a new name or carving out a new terminological space for one's view, where, we're having a dispute because I reject moral realism, but I'm not even sure I reject your position. It's just that, it becomes a semantic issue when one opts in to labels that are inclusive of a positions one doesn't hold. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's the messiness of language. It's like objectivity is this horrible word that's like this umbrella term for like universal, absolute, categorical, non-relative, eternal, like unchanging, divine, authoritative. It's like, I don't mean most of that. I just mean measurable, which I feel is like the most appropriate usage of but yeah, you're right. It's this bastardized umbrella term. So maybe semantically or linguistically, what would you recommend me call my position if my position has too much baggage, social baggage?
I don't know. I didn't choose the terminology here. I mean, I have blog posts talking about this. I talk about it on my channel. I don't like the realism, anti-realism dichotomy. And, I've even run into people with PhDs in philosophy that have said to me straight out, hey, you're an anti-realist. You don't think morality is real. The recent book by Spencer Case and Matt Lutz, it's a good book that has a nice, spirited, charitable exchange between a moral realist and a moral anti-realist. The title is Morality Real? If you ask me, is morality real, and I'm an anti-realist, it might sound a little weird, but my answer is yes, of course morality is real. Of course it's real. I don't think that there are irreducibly normative, stance-independent moral facts. That's what I don't think. I don't think some very technical, specific thing is the case. But I don't think morality isn't real. Just to give a comparison, I always give these gastronomic realism comparisons. So gastronomic realism is a very silly, satirical idea. The place I saw it originate was with Don Loeb. He has this paper called Gastronomic Realism, A Cautionary Tale. It's a really fun paper, lots of fun examples. So gastronomic realism would be this idea that there are objective or stance-independent facts about what food is good or bad and what food you should or shouldn't eat, independent of how that food tastes to you. And it's not about it's not about its like ethical, like, whether it's meat or not. It's not about it. It's not better or worse in terms of its ethical properties or its nutrition properties or its taste properties, like subjective taste properties. Some food is like intrinsically better than other foods. So caviar is intrinsically better than a Twinkie. And so if you're given the choice, you ought to eat the caviar rather than Twinkie, all else being equal. So it's obvious, it's a ridiculous idea. It doesn't matter how it tastes to you. Why? That's silly. I often make comparisons to gastronomic realism,
right?
In an effort to sort of highlight what it is about the realist accounts that I object to. And it would be a little weird because I reject gastronomic realism, I'm supposing most people do. Does that mean I don't think taste exists? Does that mean I think the culinary arts don't exist? Same thing. I'm totally fine with beauty is in the eye of the beholder, to use that really stupid cliche phrase. I'm an aesthetic anti-realist. Does that mean I think art doesn't exist? Of course not. So in all these other normative and evaluative domains, we have no problem. It looks to me like we don't have any problem not being realists about the domain, and yet speaking about them meaningfully and treating them as though they exist. And I feel like we could do the same about morality. The unfortunate thing is that the positions I take in all of these domains are called anti-realism, as if I'm denying they're real. And again, I didn't pick the terminology. I got stuck with it because that's philosophers decided to set this up. I hate this terminology. I think the terminology is super duper misleading. I don't see realist as having any special claim on what's real. I don't see anti-realist as having to deny what is real. Dan Dennett draws on. Dennett attributes it to a magician, but there was a magician who was. I think they were writing a book on like doing like magic, and they had an encounter with someone, and the person said, "Oh, so you don't do real magic?" And what do they mean by that? So there's what magicians do, like James Randi or magicians that like do illusion tricks. In a certain sense, they're doing something that they actually are doing. Like they're actually doing it. In a sense, it's real magic. But in another sense, it's not like Harry Potter magic. So it's not like actual conjure. It's not, expectro patronum or whatever. It's not like real magic in the sense of like being what we think of when we think of real magic. So there's a kind of weird inverted way in which real magic is actually fake magic and fake magic is real magic. What on earth? And that's very much how I see the realist, anti-realist dichotomy. I think morality is very much real. I wouldn't study it. I also think it's super duper important. Like it's literally, I agree with one of the first things you said. It's the most important thing because it's the sort of font from which we make all decisions, do everything. Like it's what is more important than what it is that we want out of the world. So it's super important. But philosophers are navigating the space in a way where I think is just massively misguided. I think they've just gone down deeply misguided paths. What I'd like to see us doing is saying, hey, look, I want to live my best life. I want to live a good life. You want to live your good life. Most of us want to live a good life. Maybe there's some like manipulators and psychopaths and really evil people out there. We will handle them. Like if we can help them, we'll do that. If we have to prevent them from harming people, we'll do that. There's ways of navigating those spaces. There's ways of achieving better outcomes in international diplomacy and the structure of our laws. There's so much practical work to be done. In academic philosophy, they do work on this issue. There is applied ethics and normative ethics and stuff. But in metaethics, it's so disconnected from those practical questions that I see it as effectively useless. And I'm doing it, I'm like in the field because I don't want the field to be useless. But I think it's making itself useless. And I think that's the direction a lot of analytic philosophy took, as it emerged and progressed through the 20th century. It's got a big old science envy, and it's got a chip on its shoulder where it wants to be this autonomous special discipline with its own unique methods. And I don't think I think basically it's branching itself off so far from the other fields that it's just not doing anything. And that's what I'm opposing. Now, all the labels have emerged in that context, in that history. I wouldn't label. So I proposed one labeling system, which is, I think the big problem is G.E. Moore with Principia Ethica, which is back in 1903. That's like the emergence of modern metaethics. I would be fine calling my position something like anti-Moreanism. Now, I presume you're probably not a Morean about morality. And so if I went around saying, hey, I'm an anti-Morean, I don't even know if we would be having this discussion, which would be unfortunate because I do think progress could be made on it. But like, that's what I am. I'm an anti-Morean about metaethics. I think Moore's views are very, very wrong. And all the modern views that are sort of incarnations of that, Mike Humer, Spencer Case, maybe not Spencer Case, but a lot of views that are non-naturalist realist accounts, that's what I really take issue with. So anyway, this is a very long way of addressing the labels.
Right.
You have this trade-off. You can use conventional terminology, which can facilitate understanding because if people like Google search your terminology, they'll find a literature, they'll find discussion, they'll find tweets about it or whatever. But if you use proprietary terminology, you introduce all sorts of problems. It may not catch on. It may be hard to understand you. You may have to constantly explain and re-explain your terminology over and over and over to everybody you talk to. And it could also raise questions about your credibility. So, if I was trying to be a pioneering biologist and I started inventing my own terms, biologists who and I was inventing them because I disagree with what biologists are doing. How is the biological community going to react? They're going to say, oh, you're a crackpot. And so when you start using proprietary terminology, there's a social cost that comes with it, that it can threaten your credibility. So you have huge problems here, which is if you use the conventional terminology, it sucks. That has all sorts of problems. If you depart from the conventional terminology, people might it just might not catch on, or you might look weird when you do it. Now, I am totally fine with proprietary terminology, but a lot of people are not. They like think there's something off about it. So this is a long way of saying, I don't know how to carve up the conceptual space, but I would be just like, if the realist will drop the realist label, I'm happy to drop the anti-realist label and stop calling myself an anti-realist. So I don't think you should feel like your position, like you need to switch over and call yourself an anti-realist. I don't think that. I would be happy if we didn't have the realist, anti-realist label at all. And I would also be happy with a degree of conceptual reengineering to rethink how we think about moral philosophy in a way more in line with some of what you propose and some of what I think, and dispense with the stuff that I think has conceptual foundational problems. I don't know how to proceed on that though. Sorry for such a long answer on that, but it's really true.
Yeah, that's yeah. I have a similar frustration with the philosophic terminology, and so yeah, I share that kind of confusion / frustration. But yeah, I feel like every time I try to think deeply about like these issues, I feel like there is enough objectivity to these questions to warrant the realist position. You know, that's why I felt like the anti-realism, to say there's nothing objective going on here. You know, like I can get rid of most of the definition of objectivity, but there still remains a certain definition of objectivity that I feel remains. And so I feel like I've struggled to give up that word. You know what I mean?
I get that, because what I would not want to say, or not give the impression that I'm just totally okay with any frivolous moral stance anybody takes on anything, that I think it's all just a wash and anybody can just do whatever. Like if you have a meta-ethical view that leans in too heavily into a sort of broad nihilistic worldview where you're like, nothing matters, it's all arbitrary, I think that can have downstream consequences that I don't like. I also think if you lean too hard into these really agentic conceptions of relativism where you're like, hey, I got my moral standards and you got yours. What's good for me is good for me. What's good for you is good for you. I'm not okay with that, because what if someone is like, hey, I want to, they're the, I want to eat everyone. Okay, I don't want to be eaten and I don't want them to eat everybody. So I'm not going to be okay with that. I'm not okay with any meta-ethical system that has, from my perspective, extremely undesirable practical consequences. But I think properly construed, and that's loaded, and I appreciate and recognize that. Like standard analytic metaethics just doesn't have practical implications. It only has practical implications when the views are framed in a way where it's just stipulated or baked into them that they have normative implications. And so that, like metaethics, a well-functioning metaethics, I think, would pretty much not do anything, which I think tells us something about contemporary analytic metaethics, that there's something wrong with it. I think it's too disconnected from practical reality and like actually trying to make decisions about what to do in the world. You would have thought the foundations of ethics would relate in some way to practicality, if any field of inquiry did, and yet it's disconnected. And there's something weird there. So I would like ethics as a field, like moral philosophy as a whole, to be reoriented around practical considerations at its foundation. In fact, I'd like all of philosophy to be that way. That's why I'm a pragmatist. But it's not. And, pragmatists are not common. And they are on the receiving end of ridicule, just like anti-realists are, often for similar reasons. Often it's closer to the way people dunk on utilitarianism, though.
Right.
So,
sure.
But, having said all that, there are these like important factual considerations that are very much not arbitrary. There are important considerations in, like, if we encountered an extraterrestrial civilization, how would we handle that? If we encounter, and that's kind of a weird one, but I like alien analogies. But the reason I mention that is just because aliens could have radically different goals and values than us. More mundane, bringing it back down to what goes on Earth. There are better and worse solutions to the conflicts people have when they run into one another. There's a cool book that I don't know if you've read, Josh Green's Moral Tribes.
No, but I'm a little bit familiar with his work, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so he talks about, he starts out the book with talking about this sort of allegory where there's 4 communities and they have like different moral systems, and they're all separated by a big forest in the middle, and the forest burns down, and now they could finally interact. And what he wants to argue is that some type of consequentialism or utilitarianism is what he proposes as the sort of best common currency for them to navigate their conflicts and disputes. And so in some ways, what you've said reminds me of that. And I do think that I don't endorse the view, but I think that there's something to the situation where I have my values, you're of your values. There are conflicts. It would be nice to have some sort of meta morality or some sort of normative, like to have reflected on how to navigate those conflicts in ways that optimize for my own outcomes. And
Right.
that might end up optimizing for your outcomes. Like,
Yeah.
hopefully, we get these tit for tat situations where we can all opt to cooperate. And basically, what I would say is, look, if we hypersimplify the world into a tit for tat scenario, I think I think you would want for everybody to cooperate consistently. Uh, how do we get to there? That's a practical question. I don't see it as a metaethical question.
Really? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I really like your gastronomic example and your beauty example. And I think going into that a little bit might highlight more of some disagreement, and hopefully you can address how you feel about this. Um, Abhishek, he pulled the same example on me, and I think that my view would entail gastronomic realism, which I agree on its face sounds absurd, but hear me out. Tell me what you think of this. So, words can sometimes feel arbitrary, but words are like the signifiers that point to something real, right? So the words are pointing to the ontological patterns in reality, right? So when we say something is good, we're pointing to a moral pattern. When we say something is beautiful, we're pointing to a beauty pattern. When we're saying something is tasty, we're pointing to a tasty pattern, right? Does that seem fair so far?
Sure.
Okay. And then the question is, what is the purpose of these so there's a subjective well-being, right? So there's a subjective pleasure that's associated with taste. There's a subjective pleasure associated with beauty. There's a subjective pleasure associated with morality. And when I look at it evolutionarily, I'm saying, my first question is, what are these pleasure systems supervening upon, right? There's got to be these ontological patterns that when you recognize an ontological pattern, it triggers this subjectivity. So there's this supervenience between subjectivity and objectivity. And so my question would be, well, what's that relationship, right? What is doing the triggering? Does that also make sense so far?
To an extent, I feel like maybe there would be ways of clarifying or elaborating, but I'm fine with sort of equalizing across the normative domains.
Okay, yeah. And so when I think about, for example, taste, when I think about it evolutionarily, taste should be engineered towards health, or the caloric optimization of a substance, right? There's an evolutionary reason for this subjective experience. And so I guess a biological creature, for example, sugar is a perfect example of a disconnect between the goal of taste and the subjective experience of taste, right? We subjectively think sugar is awesome, like that. We get all this pleasure from sugar, but the objective goal of that taste is to, give us energy and health. And, we're in a certain situation where we've evolved too fast, the environment has changed too quickly, and now there's a mismatch between the way our taste is designed and the actual optimum reality. And so I guess the taste of sugar, in a sense, is gastronomically incorrect in our current situation.
Yeah, I have some concerns about that. When you talk about the objective goal of taste, is that meant literally? Is that a metaphor? Because I wouldn't think of taste as having a goal. I think of goals as psychological facts about agents.
So I guess the taste would be the output of a drive, and the drive has the goal, and the drive is measuring the incoming nutrients, and it's outputting pleasure in response to these nutrients. And the problem is, it's giving us pleasure for something unhealthy when it's its function is supposed to give us pleasure for what is healthy.
Yeah, no, I get that, but like that, if it's reduced to like a descriptive fact about its function, I'm fine with that. Uh, but I would be uncomfortable with calling that like a goal of the system. I don't see systems like I have goals, but I don't see the systems that comprise me as having goals. I mean, maybe I would be okay with saying that, but I wouldn't care deliberatively about whether I have a system that's optimized for, like I have a system in my brain that's optimized for nutrient acquisition in the Pleistocene or something like that. I'm not in the Pleistocene. I have food abundance. And now if I eat, it can cause me long-term health problems. But uh, I decide on the basis of how much I want to trade long-term health problems versus the pleasure of eating food. I'm not trying to optimize for like achieving the function to which the system was adapted. If I discovered that, for instance, humans were adapted to like harm one another or do bad things, I would say so bad, so much the worse for human evolution. I don't care, and I would rebel against the functions of those systems. I'm not trying deliberatively to comport with like what the sort of underlying drives behind the various psychological systems I have. I don't know if you're proposing that we should do that or that it would be wrong not to do that. But if you are, that I do think I would raise a substantive objection to that. Like, I'm just not concerned with how the various psychological systems, like what they evolved for. I'm not trying to appease them.
Yeah. So I agree that it's not like I'm not advocating like some sort of authoritative tyranny of the gastronomic drive. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that system is not arbitrary. The telos of that system is not arbitrary. It's based on existence-based principles. Health is how we exist, and it's misconfigured for its own teleonomy.
Well, so I'm also not happy with the teleological language. Like I'm fine with some of that language being like metaphorical. Like I could, I'm fine with saying like wings are for flying, but I don't think natural selection is like goal driven or purpose driven. And so to the extent that organisms are sort of suites of adaptations, I don't see them as purposeful. I see them as, in a certain sense, accidental.
I don't think there's an end goal of evolution. I don't think that there's an eye within evolution looking for, it's projecting into the future and it says, oh, if we can make wings, that'd be great. So like, I guess there's a gap, or there's a definitional gap between teleology and teleonomy. And
Okay.
Teleology is more of there's kind of what you're objecting to, whereas teleonomy is the more emergent goal. So like top-down goal is we're looking for this and we're aiming for that. When I say teleonomy, I'm excluding that, and I'm saying the emergent processes are producing directionality towards health, right? The emergent processes produce directionality towards existence, and existence processes produce directionality towards health. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so that's fine then. I'm glad it's not the weird teleology. I don't like that stuff, and I'm glad you're not invoking that stuff.
Yeah.
I guess part of what I'm concerned with is like when I go about deliberating. Basically, what I try to do when it comes to decision making is I try to act in accordance with my goals and values. And if you point out all these facts about how hey, I'm a biological organism, I'm a product of natural selection, and the various psychological systems I have are adapted, like you could say, I would put it in like scare quotes, like for this or that purpose. That like even if I'm aware of those facts, like I could just I'm inclined to respond to that by saying, okay, that's interesting, and then go about doing what I'm doing. Knowledge of those facts doesn't strike me as having any direct, substantive, practical consequences. Like it's not going to change what I do to discover that humans evolved under conditions in which like calorie dense resources like sugar or honey were extremely rare, and so our taste receptors are like find those highly rewarding. But now I have honey and sugar on my shelf. I could go eat a bucket of honey if I wanted to, or sugar or something. Wouldn't be good for me. But the reason I don't do that is because I don't want to be in bad health, not because it would be like misaligned with the function of my taste system. Like, I don't care about the taste system. So,
Well,
and maybe you're
most
not saying I
people,
should, but
I mean, most people care about it to some degree.
well, I only care about it insofar as it facilitates my goals and interests. That's it.
Right,
So
right.
I
There's a
see, I
hierarchy of goals and interests, and it's like there's a battle between all these systems, and it's like the net result wins, right?
right, but what I'm trying to get at though is just that like I act in accordance with my goals and values.
Mhm.
I would have taken a substantive type of moral realism to say, hey, here are some moral facts. These facts are practically relevant to how you go about making decisions. Like knowledge of these facts, if it doesn't change what I do, it strikes me as a rather inert type of realism. Like it's not doing anything. I'm like, okay, those are the facts. Great. And it's just like historical. If they don't change my behavior any more than like historical trivia, like
Uh-huh.
George Washington wore a
Yeah,
beard in 1781 or whatever, like
right.
okay, And if there's a moral
Mhm.
fact like, hey, this from the point of view of the universe, or this in terms of the teleonomy of this particular psychological system is out of alignment with it, okay, I'm gonna go right back to what I was doing already. So if morality doesn't have the power to motivate changes in behavior, I'm not sure what the purpose of theorizing about it is.
Yeah. So I think that when it comes to looking for that motivational aspect, I think largely the motivational aspect comes from discovering your own goals that are of a deeper, richer nature. And so if you're operating at this level of superficial psychology where it's like, oh, I'm just trying to get the next short-term pleasure, you're missing out on these deeper, richer moral drives where it's like, well, what about meaning and purpose? Like, how am I contributing to my society? How am I increasing well-being? How am I helping the world become a better place? Like these are deeper and richer goals that are not arbitrary because they come from this directionality of social evolution. And when we see that that's where they come from, we can kind of like dig deeper within our own, evolutionary souls, and we can find this deeper reservoir of motivation within ourselves, to say, hey, I don't want to just eat short-term, I don't want the short-term pleasure of sugar because I actually have this deeper goal. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Do you think all humans have the same or very similar, like sort of fundamental goals? I don't know what you would call them.
Yeah, deeper and deeper goal is the best adjective I got right at the moment. Like I assume that most people have layers of depth to their psychology. That's the whole
Mhm.
unconscious, subconscious, conscious, dichotomy. And I think, you can meditate into those deeper values. Do
What
you
what
disagree
about
with that?
I don't know. I think so, but I'm not really sure. I suspect so. And the immediate sorts of people that came to mind are people like psychopaths.
Mhm.
I don't know that on reflection a psychopath is, and I'm thinking of like the extreme violent type of person that's like a serial killer or they enjoy eating people or something. Uh, I'm not
I
sure
love
that
this.
there's a depth there.
We should
Like
title
they
this
reflect.
cannibalistic realism.
Well, they reflect on their values and they're like, yep, I like eating people, and there's not much more to it than that. Uh,
Right.
I'm like that like I would just say that kind of sucks that's how their brain is, but I just think brains can end up that way, and that's unfortunate. But like that person, I'm not sure that there's something for them to discover about themselves. Like that just might be what they're like. What do you think?
So to extent I agree. Like I agree there's this big problem of how you're configured, right? But I think that I think that the directionality of evolution provides kind of this guardrails where like the majority of people are going to kind of be within these, more pro-social parameters because
Mhm.
that's kind of the directionality. And so we have to figure out how to adapt to the outliers, for example. But I feel like often, like, not every psychopath is like this, rampaging, murderous, sadistic monster. Like, often there are competing drives, and like, oh, this psychopath lacks empathy. But if, sometimes they care about, prestige or looking good or, how helping society. And they can harness this lack of empathy to like go do good things for society because, somehow they synergize. Yeah, it's not always completely destructive. And also like, and that I feel like my objective lens could be helpful to psychopaths. Where if you just say, oh yeah, everything's arbitrary, just do what every impulse is say. Well, the psychopath could think, well, the short-term impulse is to do crime and harm people. But it's like, what about this long-term perspective, right? There's the game theoretic nature of like, well, if you do the short-term thing, then there's tit for tat, you go to jail. It's not even in your own interest to do the short-term thing. You know what I mean? So there's this objective, non-random, nature that can kind of guide people to a little bit better behavior.
Okay. What about it seems to me that it's possible, and maybe you would disagree, for natural selection on some to shape an alien civilization to be like extremely xenophobic or highly tribal or very violent, and that could be just a deep part of their psychology. And they show up to Earth and they're like, look, we all love each other, but we don't love anybody else, and we're going to wipe out humanity and take all your resources. How would you manage that kind of, like, do you think that kind of situation is like literally not possible? If it is possible, how does that sort of interact with your account?
Yeah, I definitely think it's possible, and it goes back to this. There's the fundamental morality, there's the emergent morality, and then there's kind of the long arc telos of morality, right? And so this is kind of okay. First of all, like, from a fundamental level, xenociding people is creating all this negative well-being across all the xenocided species. So from like this objective angle of analysis, it's not a purely good behavior, right? But from their biased perspective, yeah, they could evolve an emergent game theoretic perspective where we think this is good, right? Totally possible. The other people would disagree, but from them, for their perspective, that is what morality is. From their strategy, that is the end result of their morality, is genocide is good. Totally possible. But I think, so like applying that to like the human situation, I feel like it's very relevant as humans have been genocidal in the past. What gives me hope is that there seems to be an arc of progress. It seems like these unequal strategies are not sustainable in the long term, which is why there seems to be a telos, or there's a directionality to less and less inequality, because inequality creates friction. And there's kind of this natural directionality to reducing friction. And so to me, it seems like we're evolving in the direction of more and more equality. The fact that humans are thinking about like the rights of animals is, to me, that gives me tons of hope that moral progress is going in a fantastic direction. The fact that we can have empathy for things that are, very loosely, largely irrelevant to our game theory, we're bringing into our circle of consideration. That shows like the power of, moral progress to me.
Yeah, that's a more optimistic framework than what I worry may be the reality that we're in. I do worry how fragile the progress that we've seen really is. What you'll commonly have, I'm sure I think people in the comments that may have said similar things. If you get like a Mad Max scenario, like if there's suddenly a scarcity of resources, I think we might see a sort of rapid regression in human prosociality and concerns with, under conditions of resource scarcity. I think people are very quickly going to not care very much about animal welfare because they need to eat. Uh, they might turn to cannibalism, which keeps coming up for some reason. I don't know why. That just happened.
I'm starting to wonder about you, Lance. Have you got some deeper value system we need to worry about?
Yeah, it just comes up a lot in moral philosophy. I do worry about the scenario not being quite so optimistic. But I'm glad you recognize, I'm glad you agree with me on the possibility of that, because I don't see any obvious reason why an alien civilization couldn't be that way. And it does worry me that I don't find that super implausible that they could turn out that way. Maybe, and hopefully there's something about pro-social species that they're more likely to become advanced intergalactic civilizations, and that very aggressive, hostile ones aren't. But I don't know any reason to think that that would be true. So maybe we're in for a rough billion years if humanity can survive the next few hundred or thousand years.
I'm assuming you're familiar with the dark forest hypothesis. Is that?
That sounds familiar. I probably have heard it, and I don't. Can you remind me what it is?
You're basically describing it. So, like, Fermi's paradox is the question of, there's tons of planets everywhere. How come there's no signs of alien life, right? We've been scanning the stars for radio signals, and the hypothesis is if the universe is teeming with alien life, we should be seeing some like irregular radioactive activity signifying intelligent life somewhere. We scan the entire sky looking for it, can't find it. So the Fermi paradox is, why are there no aliens or no evidence of aliens? And one of the solutions to the paradox is all the aliens, they've learned to be silent. It's the planets that release these radio signals, it's basically saying, hey, we're here, come eat me, to all the predatory aliens. And so here we are, these naive humans. We're like, hey, we're here. Are you friendly? Come visit us. And now the predators are on their way because we're too stupid to stay silent. Right?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So any beacon in the darkness is going to get snuffed out very quickly. And so everyone else is keeping their head down. That makes sense. Yeah. I don't know where I heard that, but yeah, the Fermi paradox is really, really interesting. But I do think when you start thinking, because often people will be pretty dismissive of thinking, what would aliens be like, as useless speculation. But I do think it's relevant to and ties in to game theoretic considerations in important sorts of ways, because it's important to entertain the actual real possibility of civilizations that have very different orientations in terms of their goals and perspectives than we are. I don't see that as idle speculation. I see that as important to consider now. I do know there's people that work on this. Robin Hansen has written about this recently, but I don't recall digging into it enough to actually recall what was said. But yeah, lots of people have addressed this. I don't know how to resolve the Fermi paradox. Not something I've thought about enough.
Sure.
That's a weird place to end up in this conversation. Little past 2 hours. How are you doing? Should we see if the audience has questions, or do you want to take the conversation somewhere else, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, I feel like we've hit a lot of. I feel like we've hit the most important stuff, and we've kind of agreed on and vocalized disagreement. I think it's a good time for questions.
Cool. Okay. I should have done this before, is just ask people to start queuing up the questions, especially because we've dropped about half the viewers. Would have been nice to have people anticipate getting an answer to some questions. But everybody out there. Sorry, go ahead.
Maybe I should take a bathroom break real quick while the questions come in.
Yeah, I was going to ask if we could take a quick break too. So if you got questions, we're going to give you a few minutes for both of us to come back and take a break. And then we can address some questions, and you can direct questions at either of us. And I will be right back too. All right, I am back. So I'll start looking through the questions. And we got no questions, it doesn't look like. Oh no. All right, so that's kind of a bummer. Do you, I guess if we could wait for questions if anybody has them, but do you have questions? So I asked you a ton of questions. I feel like there was an asymmetry there.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to ask me questions? If you want, we could do that.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Um, so I think you just asked me about the motivating aspect of morality. Do you
Mhm.
feel like there's a motivating aspect of anti-realism, or how do you feel like you approach that aspect of this landscape?
I don't. So, I see motivation as just a contingent feature of the way different psychological architectures are structured. And so some beings will be motivated based on one set of processes, and others will be motivated by another set of processes. I just see those as descriptive facts. Uh, I I think this idea of motivational internalism that you see in analytic metaethics, where in virtue of believing a moral fact, one is thereby necessarily, if defeasibly motivated to comply with the belief. I think that's a bit bizarre. Philosophers are welcome to stipulate that that's what they mean by a moral belief, is a belief that, among other things, is necessarily, if defeasibly motivating. Um, we would even if they propose that, then we would still have to go check human psychology to see if there is an architecture of human cognition such that, like, the proposition affirming system is connected, and like it's wired to the motivation to act system. Like, that's just one brain could be that way. And, like, okay, so let's say we find those systems in the brain, and then you, like, surgically cut them. Okay, so now what happens? Would we just say, well, because a belief is by definition necessarily motivating, this person no longer has moral beliefs? So the person's like, no, I think it's wrong, and I'm not going to do it. But I'm no longer necessarily motivated. I'm only contingently motivated. Uh, what? So, like, necessary motivation strikes me as weird. Like, if philosophers, depending on what modality they're using, if they mean like it's literally like logically necessary, that makes no sense to me. That's like saying, if this food is chocolatey, it's necessarily tasty, as if it's like an intrinsic feature of chocolatiness that it's necessarily tasty. What? I don't think that's how logical properties work. Like, you're entangling, like, nomological considerations that are just strike me as, like, obviously contingent. And so when philosophers talk about that, it just strikes me as super duper weird. Uh, yeah, I don't think there's any distinct connection between belief and motivation. I see those as rather crude, like, I almost want to say, like, pseudo or quasi psychological terms. I think if we did the appropriate cognitive psychological research, we might end up cashing out the way that human cognition works in much more precise ways. And so it might not even be that we would say humans have motivation. So we might say we might preserve the language, but we might say that they have certain types of motivations. Like, think about memory, right? So memory, it's not like we just have memory and it's like, do you remember that or not remember that? There's different types of memory. They have different cognitive architectures. They have different functions. They plausibly evolve for different purposes. They interact with one another in specific ways. Those interactions can be disconnected from one another. So the way that human memory works is, like, really kind of like idiosyncratic and really specific to the way our brains are designed. The way human memory works isn't the same way that, like, my computer's memory works. And so memory is not like, it's not like it's a thing. It refers to a cluster of things that exhibit potentially variable characteristics. I see motivation in very much the same way.
Okay, so what I was targeting was kind of like when you think about the society that you want to live in, which, like, how I assume you envision, like, there's a trajectory for the world becoming a better place. How do you navigate that from a anti-realist perspective?
Probably pretty much the same way you would. What I end up thinking about, it ends up for me being a bunch of empirical questions about, okay, I want the world to be a certain way. What can I do to get it to be that way? Well, I'm like one goofy human. I don't have a lot of power or influence. So what can I do? My options are pretty limited. For me, I've opted to go into the academic career and general hobbies, like talking to you here. that are optimizing for my comparative advantages. So I look at, well, what am I good at? So there might be things that it would be better for me to do if I were good at them. Maybe it'd be better to be a doctor, or better to make billions of dollars and donate it to charity. There might be things that if I could do those things effectively, it would be better for me to do them. But I've done the evaluation and I think, probably not so good at those things. And so I'm operating within a space of what I see as my comparative advantage for how I can have a positive impact on the world. It's kind of an indirect way. I'm probably biased towards doing things I like doing. So like I like talking to people and writing papers more than I like doing other things. So, what I try to do is see how I can best fit into contributing, a few small bricks to the overarching structure that I'd like to see the world become. So that addresses it at a personal level. If I think at a theoretical level about like how one would go about achieving the kind of world I'd want to see, that's where things quickly for me get out of hand in terms of I just don't know enough about economics and legal systems and sociology and anthropology to really have a good handle on how to address broader structural and policy issues. And so, this is another case of comparative advantage and opportunity costs in addition, which is, okay, could I meaningfully contribute to these questions? Maybe. How would I have to do that? Well, I'd have to read a whole lot. I'd have to study a whole lot of a whole bunch of different areas. I don't have the time to do that. So I've opted out of you're not going to see me talking about which economic system is best or which structure, like which laws and policies are best for the United States in 2024. I'd have to do so much research. It would take me several years to start to get a handle on that. So I see my options as very much constrained by time, energy, resources, and my comparative range of competencies. And that has limited me to operating within a relatively narrow space. I don't know if that addresses your question the way you wanted it addressed.
Yeah, that's perfectly good response. I guess maybe the follow-up question would be something like, so like my like linguistically, half of this was about semantics. Do you fear that the anti-realist approach lends itself to this arbitrary, random, nihilistic interpretation? Do you think that conflicts with like where you think like the motivational towards, I guess, how do you reconcile the cost benefits of this approach?
Yeah, I do worry about that. I don't know if it ends up, if defending anti-realism will end up having better or worse consequences than opting out of the conversation entirely or trying to sort of retrofit some type of realist characterization of my own views. It could be that those are better. This is a case where there's just so much uncertainty. I don't know how to navigate those practical questions in a way where I could be confident. Obviously, because I'm promoting anti-realism, I'm confident enough that, or I'm just like ridiculously acting without I'm being reckless. Maybe I am. I see my project with respect to anti-realism as fitting into a broader project of a kind of opposition to mainstream analytic philosophy. I started with anti-realism, but my concerns have shifted towards the methods underlying analytic philosophy as a whole. I think that it functions too much on the basis of misconceptions about language, misconceptions about human psychology, a lot of presumptions. Philosophers will say things like most people are moral realists. That's a psychological claim. They don't have any good evidence that that's true. Nobody has good evidence of that because the psychological research hasn't been done. To me, saying most people are moral realists is about as silly as saying most people's favorite fruit is a banana. Did they do research on that? No, they didn't do research on that. I did research on that, and I didn't even reach that conclusion. So I don't know what they're basing these conclusions on. I do know, and it's bad methods. It's bad armchair psychology. They'll say, well, when people say this sentence, this is what they tend to mean. And then they'll give you some highly rarefied, decontextualized English sentence. And then they think about what the people at their Thanksgiving dinner would say. Like they're not, that's not how you do, if you're going to make a psychological claim, it's not how you do it. Imagine if I said, hey, I can tell you exactly what, forget Big Five personality, forget the Myers-Briggs, forget all the personality theories out there. I'll tell you, I was once talking to the students in my class and they said this thing and this thing, and I'm going off my memory. And I'm like, this is the correct account of human personality.
Yeah.
you would get laughed out of every personality psychology conference in the world for good reason, because it's extremely challenging. Like really, 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 really hard. So hard people don't appreciate nearly how hard it is to figure out what the fundamental characteristics of human personality are when we have like tens of thousands of data points. Like it's very difficult, that are systematically gathered through validated surveys that have been developed over decades. And philosophers think they can figure out what most people everywhere in the world think by thinking about like their students. It's
Right.
outrageous. It's outrageous. And so,
Especially from their weird nation biases, right?
which I talk about constantly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all these people from very specific cultures. And I mentioned it too many times, but it's usually people that are trained in and are from cultures that are very much unlike most of the rest of the world's cultures. So they're extrapolating from. It'd be like if I went to like a monster truck show, and I talked to 6 people there, and I said everyone is like the 6 people I talked to at the monster truck show. They all love beer. Like I don't know what people like. I'm not trying to insult people at monster truck shows. I'm saying
Stereotyping.
There's specific traits they might exhibit. Or if I go, I go to a metal concert. Most of the people there like metal. Everybody likes metal. It's their favorite kind of music. That's a ridiculous extrapolation. So if you go to a monster truck show, people are going to have certain preferences and interests, and there's going to be sociocultural factors that cause those people, as opposed to other people, to go to a monster truck show. And you can meet those people, and they exhibit all these demographic characteristics, and whatever's true of them, it's not plausible that it's going to be true of people everywhere. That would be ridiculous. So why philosophers think they're in a position to make these sorts of judgments is beyond me. The justifications and reasons they give strike me as inane. Like they're just terrible justifications. And so I see my opposition to moral realism as part of an opposition to the field that is sort of taken over the task of addressing the most fundamental questions in the world, is taken over by people that are using really, really, really bad methods. And that bothers me. It'd be very much like, imagine if 80 or 90% of the people in medicine were doing like alchemy or astrology, and they were like, you're a Gemini, and so you need like, the Eye of Newt, and it has to be, I need to cast an incantation over it. I think I might go into medicine to say, that's stupid. Can you do actual medicine, please? And so
you become,
I see myself doing that.
You become anti-medical until the definition of medical changes, basically.
Right. And so if medicine were astrology, I would be anti-medicine. It's not, fortunately. But I think philosophy, very much analytic philosophy, has massive problems. And that's not even getting into the problems of continental philosophy. But I see this sort of fight as one that's more about, hey, how can we reform philosophy as a whole? And I do think that's a worthwhile enterprise, because I think if we could reorient philosophy on better methodological foundations, it could make serious progress. It could become more practical. It could become more relevant. And it doesn't have to be so insular and self-absorbed and just circling a drain of useless nitpicking about how words are used. It's just there's just too much of that.
I absolutely love how you bring the rigor of your psychological practice to philosophy. I totally agree. We need more of that. So that's awesome. We did get a question in the comments.
All right. So the question is from Aaron. I have a question for both of you, if you're keen to answer it. Do you think that truth and value are correlated, not a moral question per se? You want to address that?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, I reduce value to sentience. Sentience is basically, it's your ability to feel, and there's a valence between positive feeling and negative feeling. And so there's positive value and negative value, and creatures, evolve to identify value, and they communicate it to themselves through sentience. And I think that there's a relationship of supervenience, where the creature is trying to figure out the truth. And if it's a good truth, then they try to interpret that as positive value. And if it's a bad truth, they try to interpret that as negative value. So it's kind of the subjective objective supervenience distinction.
Gotcha. Okay. So my approach to this is quite a bit different, I think. And I don't know if this is addressing. I'm always worried when people ask questions that I'm addressing a somewhat orthogonal question because of how I interpret them. But I'll do my best. So since I'm a pragmatist about these sorts of questions, I actually see truth. And like when you ask if they're correlated, the answer is yes. The correlation is like a perfect correlation, because I think that truth, on my view, is a kind of, it's not that there are things that are true out there, and then through the process of inquiry, we discover what's true. Rather, I see truth as the product of inquiry, that things, in a certain sense, become true in virtue of our methods of inquiry. And so truth for me, and because those methods of inquiry ultimately turn on our values, truth is actually the end product of a sort of evaluation of the world. And so truth and value to me are inseparable. I wouldn't say they're interchangeable. Like the use of the term truth and discussion of truth has a distinctive role to play in conversations and discourse and the way that we go about thinking about things. But truth, I think things in a certain sense become true when they are appropriately integrated into a broader framework of the rest of our model or understanding of what the world is like. They are the result of a process of inquiry. When certain sorts of claims stand in, I guess you could say, a sort of healthy, structured relation to the rest of our claims, that they're absorbed into our sort of deck of beliefs in a way where they cash themselves out in terms of allowing us to reliably achieve our goals, of making predictions, of anticipating future experiences. They end up, in that sense, that is what constitutes their truth. Their truth is their value. So for me, the two are perfectly correlated because they collapse into one another.
Yeah,
I don't see any questions beside that. So sorry.
Yeah, this reminds me of a frequent critique of, like, I guess what's the best way to phrase this? So often I see theists attack evolutionists, if we want to call them that, and they'll say something to the effect of evolution designs creatures for evolutionary value, and value is independent of truth. Therefore, it sabotages the evolutionists' justification for believing they have any knowledge of truth. What do you think about that in turn? Do you think that's related to the question?
I don't think so. No, I do know people make those kinds of arguments. I'd have to. Those are the kinds of arguments that I think are best handled sort of dialectically. Like I'd like to see how the person develops what they're saying and why they're saying it, and then and then respond to the like specifics of what they're saying. But yeah, I don't know that that's related to this remark. That's why I don't know exactly what they're getting at here.
Right. Yeah, my usual response is basically, truth is basically a mechanism. I think you said it the same way as well. Truth is part of the ingredients for us to get what we value. So in order for us to get, for example, in order for us to get food, we need knowledge of the truths of reality and the truths of the methodologies for obtaining that food. And so you can't just say the process of evolution is completely truth independent. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I've seen that kind of response. I also just worry that a lot of these sorts of these objections are based on an assumption that we're endorsing a truth correspondence, like a correspondence theory of truth. And since I don't endorse one of those sorts of concerns just don't, I suspect they don't arise for me. I don't know if there's a version of those sorts of evolutionary objections that arise for pragmatists. More generally, pragmatists just completely circumvent the standard sort of skeptical concerns that have been raised in the philosophical literature. And I think it's one of the big virtues of a pragmatist approach, which is that it's sort of it doesn't just like have a response to skeptical concerns. It can just say, look, the skeptical concerns literally don't arise when you reconceptualize things from the ground up within a pragmatist framework. It has a way of, it's not like, here's a problem, oh, I have a solution. It's not putting a patch over a crack. It's we don't even get the crack in our approach to things. And I see that as a huge advantage for it. And, I've just started discovering sort of that I've been a sort of unknowing pragmatist all along. And I was informed by a pragmatist like, hey, you really seem to think in line with pragmatists. I started to look at what they said. And then I'm like, yeah, that's how I think about things. And I'm starting to increasingly see how powerful of a system it is. And I'm just not convinced by what few objections I've initially seen in reading about it. But I have a lot more reading on this to do. I mean, I was off in psychology and metaethics land for a decade. So it's only been about a year since I've been reading this stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like a whole nother podcast topic, the nature of truth.
Yeah, that's a big one. Oh, right. So since we didn't get a lot of questions out, maybe we should have asked in the beginning.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any other directions. I feel like if we want to, I'd be happy to talk again, but maybe we should wrap things up.
Yeah, I feel like we've done enough to wrap things up now.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. All right. So I will put well, actually, I think it's already there. I think there is a link to your channel in the description. So people should definitely go check out your channel. Is there anything else you want to like closing remarks, anything else you want to say? Otherwise we'll just say goodbye to everybody and end the stream.
No, this has been a great conversation. Really appreciated it. I love your take on philosophy, and I assume we'll have many more good conversations to come. So appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it too. Thanks so much for being here. One other thing I want to thank you for is being able to have like a conversation that seems collaborative rather than argumentative. I do see the value of more combative debates, but I often don't find them as valuable as more collaborative discussions. And I do wish more philosophy was constructive in that sense, but which may be at odds with how I write, but whatever. Anyway, so I appreciate you having you here, and I hope we have more conversations. I had a lot of fun. And yeah, maybe we'll get more audience engagement next time if we interact with them a bit, like while things are rolling like the first hour. Yeah.
Sure.
Cool. Okay. Thanks everybody. Please like the video, subscribe. This also streamed over on Transcendent Philosophy, so go check it out over there. Give that video a like. Do leave comments. Be civil if you're commenting on either of our versions of the video. And I will see you all next time. Take care, everybody.